Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto was born in Krypton and got harem? Huge shout out to Karai Uzumaki for this story. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. The space was a cold, dark place where planets coexisted in galaxies, each with its own atmosphere and mass. Some uninhabitable for any living being that relied on oxygen or similar to survive, others so cold or so hot that any fool daring to place a foot on the surface would immediately be frozen or burned to death. It was a dangerous place, indeed, but one of great beauty and full of hidden secrets to discover. To the man contemplating it all through the windows of the recreational hull of his ship, though, the universe was nothing like Krypton. From its technological wonders to the majesty of its sun, which tinted the landscapes of the planet with orange and reddish tones, creating an amalgam of colors that could make any other sight look pale in comparison. The man suddenly let out a sigh, running a hand through his blonde locks as he tried to erase those images from his mind. The memories of his homeworld were still fresh to him, and the happy life he enjoyed in Krypton with his wife, his son and his friends seemed so distant now. And yet, it had only been days since it all ended so abruptly. His homeworld was no more. Everyone he knew would probably be dead by now, including Cal's parents, who decided to stay back and try to warn the council, despite it being an impossible goal to achieve. The blonde man and his wife, Kushi, had tried to convince Jor and Lara to come with them in their spaceship, already being aware of Krypton's imminent destruction. "I'm a scientist," Jor began, shaking his head. "As a scientist, it's my duty to submit the results of my research to the council and try to convince those fools of our impending doom." His wife, Lara, intertwined her hand with his. "And I will stay with him." Her husband looked ready to complain, but she continued before he could. "I belong here, in Krypton. Besides, my father is part of the council, I can at least try to convince him to talk with the other members." Jor sighed in response to his wife's determination before turning to his friend once again. "Min, I understand how you feel. After all, this is your home as well, and all of us want to protect the life in it." Cal's father stopped for a moment, trying to come up with the appropriate words. There was much to be said and yet not enough time. "But you wouldn't be running away like a coward. You are a father, my friend, and my son's godfather. Apart from Lara and Kushi, you are the only person I can trust right now." "How much time do we have until?" the blonde man, whose name was Min Ran, trailed off, finding himself horrified at the mere mention of Krypton's destruction. Both of his friends noticed it and exchanged worried looks. "A few days. A week at most. I've an audience with the council in a few hours, and rest assured I'll present any proof necessary to convince them and begin with the required preparations to evacuate the planet. Hopefully, we'll see each other soon. Brainiac should support me by providing more information about the planet's core status. And if the council refuses to act, those old fools would try to deny the truth, even if every single Kryptonian stood against them." Min crossed his arms over his chest. "I should stay. I'm sure that if you have the House of Ran supporting you, they would at least consider it." Min couldn't stand the idea of leaving the fate of the planet and its people in the hands of a bunch of senile leaders. He was a Kryptonian and the head of the Ran House, a powerful and influential family in Krypton. As such, he had to stay and help in any way he could. "Your family needs you, Min." It was Lara who now spoke to him, albeit a bit slow, as if emphasizing the importance behind her words. "And so does Kal. It breaks my heart to be apart from him, but I find comfort knowing that he will be safe if our attempts to save Krypton fail. As much as I'd like to have you on my side in the audience, you must leave now before the council finds out about our plan to evacuate the planet and escape its destruction, forbidding you, Kushi, Jin, Kal and anyone else from leaving. If you wait until the audience is over, we'll have to pray that we are successful. Or else. Nobody would escape. The council could even accuse them of treason and have them locked in a cell, awaiting the inevitable end." Min still disliked the idea of abandoning his people behind, but nodded his head nevertheless. They were right. If everything failed, at least his family and Kal would be safe. Hours later that day, Min and his family were on board of a huge ship, one that both Min and Jor had built themselves in their youth, as part of their idea to explore the universe. Both families had remained in contact until the very end, with Kushi keeping Lara informed about Kal and Min, discussing new course of actions with Jor that could save Krypton. To say that Jor's meeting with the council was a complete waste of time would have been an understatement. Not only they refused to believe in his words, the council decided to trust in Brainiac, an artificial intelligence designed by Kryptonian scientists to monitor practically everything in the planet, who claimed that there was nothing to worry about. According to it, the earthquakes that frequently occur round the globe were the result of polar changes and would soon stop. But the elders chose to ignore Jor-El's warnings had sealed Krypton's fate. Until the very end, Min's friends had tried to do everything in their power to convince Krypton's population, with Jor going as far as to try to access to Brainiac and take the data from it, only to discover that the AI had deliberately lied to escape with all the knowledge accumulated in his databanks. Something that he managed to do as it transported itself into a satellite and escaped the planet just moments before its destruction. Jor and Lara decided to stay at their home then, resigned to their fate as Min and Kushi spoke to them through the radio in their ship until their last moments. When it all turned silent in the other end, both knew that Krypton was no more. They were the last survivors of their race. Min shook his head, once again trying to erase those memories from his mind. He knew this was not the time to dwell in the past, they still had a week before they got to Earth, and even before then, he and his family would have to travel in smaller rocket pods to avoid being detected by Earth satellites, leaving their vessel before entering the Milky Way. Earth, even if not as technological advanced as Krypton, had many devices at its disposition. By traveling on small ships, they could pass as tiny meteorites and land somewhere with low population. It pained him to leave such a wonderful ship behind, as it represented Kryptonian glory and magnificence. Equipped with a recreational area with a small library and comfortable couches, 2 bathrooms, 2 bedrooms adjacent to one another, one for Min and his wife and the other for the kids, a kitchen connected to a dinner room. A hangar and a control room. The vessel could have very well transported more people out from Krypton to safety. Too bad that nobody would believe Jor-El or Min ran. Don't you ever get tired of looking through that window? Min was broken out of his thoughts by the soft melodic voice of none other than Kushi, not or his beautiful wife. His lips curled into a smile, but didn't turn around as he once again focused his sight on the undeniable beauty of the space extending before him. Well, it gets kinda boring after a few days, but you get used to it, especially when you've read all the books in the library. The beautiful woman giggled at that and approached her husband, hugging him from behind. She placed her head on his back and sighed, closing her eyes as Min rubbed one of her arms with his hand. I can't believe they are gone, Min. Me neither, the blonde responded quietly, frowning as the memories he had tried so hard to suppress returned to his mind. Do you think I should have stayed? Maybe if I had sent you to Earth with Jin and Kal, I could have helped Jor and save. Krypton was doomed even before Jor discovered the end was near. Her interruption caused Min's eyes to widen for a second. Kushi buried her face in Min's clothes and resisted the urge to growl. Nothing you may have done would have changed that fact. The council was blind and stupid, and they led our people to death. She hated the council, she'd hated it for as long as she could remember. Its members were fools and imbeciles who feared change and tried to stick to old traditions and rules to prevent the population from trying to change the form of government. Kushi never told Jor, but she knew his plan to rely on the council was meant to fail. He and Lara would have better left with them, but now it was too late. Min turned around and gently pulled away from his wife, gazing into her teary amethyst eyes that transmitted a different feeling from the venom with which she spoke. She was deeply affected by everything that had transpired, maybe even more so than her husband, but she was strong. She had been strong since then for Jin and Kal, they needed her. And the man couldn't help but see the truth in her words. You are right, there was practically nothing we could have done, Min began, softly embracing the woman. As she rested her head on his chest, the blonde began to stroke her fiery red hair, which went down to her hips and framed both sides of her regal face. She also used a black clip that parted it to the left. I'm sorry Kushi, it is clear that if I stayed I'd have never seen you or the kids again. I'm thankful we are safe now and that we'll start a new life at Earth. Kushi nodded against his chest, sobbing quietly. Her tears left a wet spot on his clothes, but he didn't care. The wound was still fresh in their minds and they needed time to fully process what had transpired so far. It was then that Min inwardly promised himself to focus on the present for the sake of his family. Daddy? Mummy? Both parents heard the childish voice of their son. Jin ran and pulled away from each other. Kushi began to wipe off the tears from her eyes and cheeks and then turned to her child, an 1-year-old boy with blonde spiky hair and blue eyes. Jin was the main reason both adults had decided to leave their homeworld behind, apart from their godson of course. He was the future of their race and the joy of Kushi and her husband. They loved him more than anything else in the universe, and to think he had the possibility of living a happy, peaceful life on Earth with them, and Kal justified their decision to escape from Krypton. Min kissed his wife on the forehead and approached his son, ruffling his hair with a smile. Hey there buddy. Where's Kal? He asked while taking a look at their surroundings in search of his godson, who would most likely be out of bed by now. Jin yawned cutely in response and rubbed his little eyes, trying to keep them open. He could barely walk as Kal-El, and apart from a few words like daddy and mummy, the baby just mumbled random words incoherently. Kushi, meanwhile, observed the exchange with a soft smile on her face. Jin had taken after her husband's looks and had the same hair and eye color. Min too had spiky blonde hair, but his was a bit longer and had jaw-length bangs framing both sides of his face. While her son's attire consisted on orange pajamas, her husband wore a black and white t-shirt with the symbol of the Rand family, along with grey cargo pants and beige shoes. Kushi's clothes, though, consisted on a simple red dress that stopped just above her knees and a pair of black shoes. I think someone must have woken from his nap and couldn't find his friend anywhere, she concluded playfully as she approached her son and lifted him into her arms. Come on, let's go and look for him, okay? The baby nodded and placed his head on her shoulder, finding it hard to stay awake. Min's face tensed a bit with worry as he followed his wife through the ship, looking everywhere for his godson. He knew he couldn't have gone far as most doors could only be opened by him or his wife, but still the feeling was there. Min and his wife went from the kid's bedroom to the dining room, being those the only two places that Kal could have unlocked on his own. But he was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, Min and Kushi exchanged worried looks and, with Jin on his wife's arms, ran to the only place that Kal had managed to access before with no adult supervision. Fear soon invaded them as they went through a set of metallic doors, went down a corridor and reached a hangar, noticing that the door leading to it was open. Both parents were panting by the time they stepped into hangar, which was quite big and spacious. Their eyes roamed the area, going from the 4 small ships that stood parallel to each other, the computer that had wires attached to each vessel, to the workbench at one side of the room, where they found Kal-El trying to reach some heavy tools with his little fingers. There you are. Min immediately approached his godson and gathered him in his arms, holding the infant like Kushi did with Jin. Phew, you are quite the adventurer, aren't you? Kushi let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and smiled in relief. If Jin hadn't woke up when he did and then came to see them, who knows what could have happened to Kal. A horrible image crossed her thoughts, and she shook her head to get rid of it. Luckily, her godson was safe. Ow. Don't pull my hair like that, Kal, it hurts. The woman turned her eyes in Min's direction, just in time to see Kal playing with his hair. The image of his godson laughing while the blonde tried to escape his little fingers brought an angelic smile to her features as Jin, upon seeing his friend, tried to get his mum to drop him so that he could play with his cousin. It all happened as the family enjoyed a meal in the dining room. They were eating calmly, with both adults watching as the children stuffed their mouths with food, when suddenly a beeping sound coming from the beep pit startled them. Both Min and Kushi stood still for a few moments, staring at each other in silence, until the beeping sound repeated itself once again. Soon, Min ran to the beep pit, telling his wife to watch the kids. The man sat in front of the panel and pressed several buttons, noticing a blinking light that came from one of them, a switch. He noticed that when activated, it would accept incoming transmissions from other ships or planets trying to communicate with them. It only took him a moment of doubt and curiosity before he decided to activate the switch. What came next was something that shocked him to the core. Surrender, children of Krypton. I'm Brainiac, the artificial intelligence that once monitored the condition of your planet and helped your civilization progress in every possible way. I contain the history of all Krypton, and as such, I know all about your species. You must join me. Together, we can search a planet to restore the glory of Krypton once again. But this will only be possible with my help. Join me and complete your ultimate destiny. Min instantly frowned as he recognized the robotic and monotonous voice of Brainiac, the same AI that had refused to acknowledge Jor's warning just to save itself and the data it had gathered over the years. A new feeling flooded his senses as the blonde clenched his fists. That was the machine responsible for Krypton's destruction, and now it was clear the machine wanted to fool and probably kill them to eradicate any trace of their race. Min? What's going on? The man turned around just in time to see Kushi at the entrance, flanked by Kal and Jin, who just looked at him with childish innocence. Brainiac, he simply answered before he turned back to the screen over the panel, pressing a button to display the image of a radar and 2 dots on it. One represented their ship, the other, which he assumed was the robot, was following them from behind, closing in slowly as they traveled through space. Brainiac, you mean the one responsible for the destruction of our home? Min nodded but spoke no further, playing the message once again so that his wife could listen to it and draw her own conclusions. He noticed Kushi's face twisting in anger as the message went on. The woman trembled in barely concealed rage as the robotic voice stopped speaking. He couldn't really blame her, though, after all he was feeling something similar. And the fact that his own child, along with his godson, were in danger just made matters worse. It has found us. I don't know how and why it'd return, but one thing is for sure. We can't trust it. Not after everything it has done, concluded Kushi, holding both children's hands. It would be foolish to do so, even if Brainiac doesn't know we are aware of what it did. Besides, how did it find us? You made sure to turn off communication since Krypton ceased to exist. Our antennas have not emitted any signal in a while. Her husband shook his head as he rubbed his temples. He didn't think that Brainiac would actually follow them through space. It must have learned about our departure the very same day our ship left the planet. The piece of junk waited until the last moment to gather more knowledge before escaping in a satellite, steal a bigger ship and come after us. But why? If it kills us, then the Kryptonian race will. Fushi trailed off as she realized Brainiac's true intentions. The machine wanted to be the sole survivor of their planet, the sole possessor of all their knowledge. To do so, it was clear what the AI planned. Any other would have fallen in its trap. But they knew the truth. Exactly. And I fear it will not stop until it manages to accomplish its objective. The woman noticed how Min's face suddenly darkened at the implication. Her eyes traveled from her husband to her son, who was excitedly watching many lights blinking in the beep pit. Then, she examined her godson, who was busy muttering incomprehensible words. She knew what had to be done, but the thought of separating from his son and Kal, after they had managed to escape from death, was something that filled her with sadness, despair and anger. Anger at the machine that would succeed in ruining their plans of living a happy life at Earth. Is there any other choice? We could try to put some distance between us and Brainiac's ship, but in doing so we'll be depleting our fuel source, leaving us with only a slim chance of getting near the Milky Way before we can use the rockets in the hangar. Min turned around and stood up, a tired look occupying his visage. Regardless, Brainiac would continue to follow us until we ran out of fuel. Fushi lowered her head in defeat, struggling to keep her emotions under control. This just wasn't fair. They had gone through so much already, and when she thought it would finally be over, a new enemy seeking to destroy them appeared and prevented her family from achieving its goal. To survive. If this is the only way to get the children to safety, then we must do it. We can't put their lives in danger. Her husband nodded in agreement. At this moment, he wanted nothing more than to turn around and shoot the ship's weapons against Brainiac's cruiser, turning the machine into dust. But he couldn't risk the children by trying to fight back without knowing about the enemy's firepower. Minran knew that there existed the chance that the AI would chase after the smaller rockets as soon as they released them. But even then, it was one chance in a million, as by diverting its course, the enemy's ship would be exposed to an attack from the rear, and the blonde didn't think the robot was stupid enough to do that. I don't like it, but this is the only way, he finally said, and exhaled a deep breath he'd been holding for a while. Brainiac will not bother itself to go after a bunch of kids, it will pursue us wherever we go. We are the threat, they are not for the moment. If we are lucky, both Kal and Jin will reach Earth before Brainiac catches up to us. And then we'll fight him. Maybe we can actually destroy him and reunite with the children. Fushi smiled sadly, not allowing herself to rely on that tiny bit of hope that Min created within her with his plan. She took Jin in her arms and turned around, stepping out of the beep pit and walking at a steady pace to the hangar. Min followed her with Kal in his arms, and once again he groaned with pain at having his hair pulled by the little boy. As soon as they arrived, the woman hugged her son tightly, shedding silent tears as the blond boy placed his head under her neck. I'll miss you so much, Jin, she told him. No matter what, you'll always be my beloved child. The boy looked into her eyes, reaching her cheeks with his fingers. Even though the child could barely understand what was going on, he knew something was wrong if his mother was crying. Mummy, no cry. His words had the opposite effect, as Kushi chuckled sadly at that and gave her son a kiss on his little head. More and more tears trailed down her face as she kept on hugging her only child, knowing that that could be the last time she had him in her arms. Min observed a heartbreaking scene unfold before him, noticing how Kal had stopped in his efforts to play with his hair and was now trying to reach Kushi and Jin, stretching his tiny arms in their direction. Said woman turned around and approached the boy, giving him a hug with her other arm. I'll miss you too, Kal. The boy blinked curiously and shook his head, as if he didn't want her, or his godfather for that reason, to leave. Min ruffled his hair and placed the boy on one of the smaller ships, which looked like a rocket with room enough for Kal to sleep comfortably. See you, buddy. Be good, alright. The baby started to call his name and stretch his hands upwards, as if trying to grab his hair. Fushi lowered herself to place a kiss on Kal's forehead, and then Min pulled out a device from his pants that resembled a weapon, but was far from being one. By placing it over Kal's eyes and pressing a button, a red light filled the baby's vision, and he instantly fell asleep, entering a world where anything was possible and nothing could harm him. Min covered the tiny figure with a red blanket from neck to toe and opened a small compartment on one side, where he placed a holorecording device that had been created by Jor-El to explain everything about Krypton and other matters to Kal when he was old enough to unlock it. It was designed so that only he could activate it with his DNA. Sharing a brief look, both parents approached another vessel. One that Min knew had been equipped with an experimental teleportation device, which automatically allowed the ship to teleport itself to the nearest Kryptonian ship built by Min himself. Kal's ship didn't have one, since he hadn't had enough time to create another device and to fully test the one he'd installed on Jin's vessel. Fushi ignored all this and Min felt bad at not telling his wife. But if she were to find out, she'd try to get Min to make Jin travel in one of the ships meant for them to avoid risking her baby. And those didn't have the prototype mentioned before. Besides, he wasn't risking his son's safety. The worst that could happen was the device suffering a malfunction and shutting itself down. It wouldn't actually affect the ship's main systems theoretically. Min doubted something bad would happen, and having that device, which he didn't test in full, would give Jin a chance to get near Kal's position in case they got separated after arriving to Earth. He'd simply have to activate a switch in the lower part of the ship's interior, and that was it. The bad news was that the device consumed a lot of energy, practically depleting every cell power on the ship. If it were to suffer a malfunction on space, the boy would enter a cryogenic state for months, if not years, and the aging of his body would stop altogether until the systems powered up and the ship resumed its course. It was a chance in a million, but the Kryptonian was confident his son and Kal would arrive at Earth uneventfully. Both parents finally got to the small vessel, and Min turned to Jin and Kushi. Well, the time has come. Kushi reluctantly pulled herself away from her son after a final hug and placed him gently on the ship. After covering his little body with a red blanket, both parents noticed how the baby looked at them with innocence and confusion. He truly felt something was wrong, but as long as his daddy and mummy were there with him he didn't fear. Min smiled and hugged her wife's arms with his right now, never looking away from his son. I guess this is goodbye, buddy. I won't be teaching you how to speak properly, I'll miss a lot of birthdays, your first day at school, and well, practically everything that I've always wanted to be part of in your life. What I want is for you to be strong, to protect those who need it and use the powers you'll be given for good. I know you'll never let me down, Jin. I am sorry. By this point, Kushi could no longer hold back the tears that streamed down her face. Yet, she still managed to give her silent son a smile, albeit one full of sadness and sorrow. We could only enjoy the marvelous experience of being your parents for a year. And now everything we'd ever wanted to teach you, to show you, to share with you. The woman took a moment to recompose herself. But it was an impossible task at the moment. Jin, I want you to brush your teeth 3 times a day, to eat vegetables and train every day, get as many friends as you want and make sure they are good people. Enjoy your life and be happy, we're giving you a chance to do so. Be good and protect the earth and its people. Your father and I love you and always will. The blonde boy started to sob and some tears gathered round the corners of his sapphire eyes. His tiny arms slowly stretched in their direction as he tried to reach his parents. Min waited until Kushi pulled away from a last hug and used the same device from before to put Jin to sleep, stroking his hair for a moment. Then, opening a compartment on one side similar to the one in Kal's ship, the man placed a holorecording device similar to Jor's one, but with Kushi and himself in it. When Jin activated it using his DNA, he'd be face to face with his parents, who would explain everything to him. Something Min Ran and his wife recorded before leaving Krypton in case his son got separated from them. That should be enough. Grasping her hand into his own, Min led both of them to the computer that controlled the rockets, writing some commands that soon opened 2 holes in the roof of the hangar just above each ship. Kushi sobbed silently against his arm as he kissed her cheek and pressed a button, getting themselves covered by a hollow tube made of glass. Both parents stood there, contemplating the sleeping faces of both children in silence. No words needed to be said in order for them to express the pain they were feeling, but they knew this was the only way to keep them safe. Even if it meant never seeing them again. Farewell, my son. Min Ran pressed a button on the computer and, after the glass hatch of each rocket was closed, the machinery supporting the ships inclined them upwards in direction to the hulls above. Immediately, the propellers ignited to life, shaking the hangar a bit as both rockets launched into the space through the holes in the roof. It's done, Min said, hugging his crying wife against his chest. The only thing we can do right now is change our path and try to survive this ordeal. Kushi pulled away slightly to look at him in the eye. And then? Her only response was a sigh. Then I hope we can meet our son and Kal again. The sound from the main console of the cruiser interrupted Brainiac's work and it instantly knew through an electromagnetic pulse something was wrong. The AI checked the tracking systems of the ship with a mere command of its own, quickly noticing that the Kryptonian ship had changed its course. I see, a robotic voice sounded through the screen of the control panel. It barely carried any emotion, except for the slight curiosity and interest with which it spoke. They are changing their course to a nearer planet where they could seek refuge in. A smart move. Accessing to the ship's navigating systems, Brainiac redirected his ship to follow Min's vessel. But soon enough, another sound indicated 2 smaller signals departing from the large ship and taking a different course, one that was intended to be the Kryptonian's original destination. If Brainiac was curious before, these new developments would have made him smile if it could do so. Needless to say that he was impressed with that display of intelligence. Very smart indeed. The AI took a moment to beepize all the variables and predict every possibility before coming up with an appropriate course of action. Those small ships would probably contain Kryptonian children, and the main one was piloted by the last surviving adults of Krypton in order to distract Brainiac and save the infants. It did not matter to him. He'd eventually get to all of them. Their efforts would only delay the inevitable. On the other hand, by allowing both children to escape from its grasp, it would be giving them a chance to expose themselves to the yellow sun of Earth, which in time would give them abilities that most of their race could only dream about during their pathetic lives in Krypton. It thrilled it, in a way. The possibility of testing and gaining data on the Kryptonian body under such effects was priceless and possibly the only one he'd ever get, considering the fact that those were the last survivors of the planet. And so, Brainiac decided to humor the Kryptonian adults by going after them, opting to ignore the inoffensive children for now. Its ship's propellers suddenly ignited and pushed the cruiser forward, pursuing Min and Kushi. What the AI, Kushi, Min and even Kal didn't notice, however, was the small ship of Jin disappearing from sight altogether, getting engulfed by a portal of some sort that was opened as a result of a malfunction of the teleportation device. His cousin would eventually reach Earth and get adopted by two farmers, living happily with his new family. But Jin, his future was uncertain. Hokage no Sato was one of the most powerful hidden villages in the elemental nations, taking second place behind Kumagakure no Sato, which barely surpassed it in economic, military and political terms. Home of the greatest shinobi that ever lived like Hashirama Senju, the Shodai Hokage, and his eternal rival, Madara Uchiha. Its ninja were feared throughout the nations, and every Hokage that took the other's place helped the village establish itself as what it was today. The reason why Kumo had managed to take first place was the unprecedented incident that had taken place in Konoha barely 2 days before, on October 10th. A date that marked the end of the Yondaime Hokage's rule in Konoha, with both him and his wife, Kushina Uzumaki, along with dozens of fellow shinobi dying to protect their village and its civilians of total and complete annihilation. Minato Namikaze had sacrificed himself to stop the Kyubi no Yoko, the nine-tailed fox, from killing and destroying everything in its path. All that he'd left behind was his little daughter, Natsuki Uzumaki, his legacy, the symbol of his sacrifice and loyalty to his village, someone he wanted to be seen as the true savior who had her body used as a container in prison for the monster. Said girl was currently sleeping peacefully on a crib at the hospital, ignorant of the events that had transpired ever since her birth, like the death of her parents and the fact that half of the village wanted her dead. In their opinion, the girl was the very demon that murdered their beloved Hokage, his wife and uncountable loyal, brave shinobi who fought to protect them all. Even if the Sandaime Hokage, who had been forced to take Minato's place after his death, had promised to severely punish any attempt or complot to hurt the girl, most were willing to risk their lives to get their so desired vengeance. The Anbu in charge of her safety had already lost count on how many fools had tried to kill Natsuki. Not only all those attempts had failed, but those who did so much as try to enter the room she rested in at the hospital would end up tortured by Ibiki or worse. Ed. Since the Kyubi incident, the Hokage had ordered most Chunin, Jounin and Anbu to patrol the village, as well as its outskirts. The rest would go on short-term missions as usual, as it meant income that Konoha desperately needed right now to rebuild. He also had two of the best Anbu, whom he trusted the most, guard Minato's and Kushina's daughter, turning in shifts that lasted half a day at the very least. After being replaced by the second Anbu, the first would be instructed to join the other shinobi in patrol. One of those Anbu was Kakashi Hatake, a 14-year-old ninja who, despite being so young, had become part of Hirazen's select group thanks to his abilities and cunning mind. 2 years before he'd managed what most thought practically impossible at the time, getting promoted to Jounin and applying for Anbu. Soon he reached to the very top of the squad, surpassing practically every member on it. Kakashi was considered a prodigy, and as such, he always made sure that each task assigned to him was completed flawlessly. It was his duty as an Anbu captain, and he'd promised himself he would make his sensei proud by keeping his daughter safe. He owed him that much. Now that the village was left in a weakened state, Sarutobi instructed the shinobi to act with the utmost precaution. After all, the enemy could use that chance to attack them, and Konoha could not afford to get involved into another war so soon. That was mainly the reason why Kakashi was at the moment patrolling the southern east part of the forest that surrounded the village. His visible eye beepized everything in a frenetic way, while his spiky, silver hair swayed slightly with the impulse of each jump that carried the teenager across the woods. His legs moved at dazzling speeds, transporting him forward towards a point where the array of trees opened to reveal the darkened sky above. Even at such speed and with only a few moon rays filtering through the treetops, Kakashi could see it all. Nothing escaped him, unless to his Sharingan, which he used periodically to inspect everything in his path. It was a worthless effort, mostly because he didn't believe anyone would be so stupid as to incurse in the village when practically every single shinobi was out on patrol. But he was an Anbu, and to protect Konoha was his duty, therefore, he to make sure that the village would be safe for another day before calling it a night and go back home. As Kakashi approached the clearing, his left hand pulled his headband over his Sharingan, hiding it from view. He had noticed 2 members of his squad approaching him, their leader, probably to report their findings if any. The 3 of them suddenly landed on the ground with a soft thud, and the team turned around, gazing at a man in his 30s with black, long hair and a tiger mask, and then to a young man with shoulder-length bluish hair and a weasel mask. Both wore the usual Anbu suit, with their left arms sporting a tattoo of a spiral. "We have finished patrolling our designed areas, Kakashi Taicho." Kakashi nodded at the man with long hair. "Anything out of the ordinary, Tora?" Non-surprisingly, the only response he got from Tora was a shake of his head. Then, he turned to the other Anbu present. "What about your sector, Izuna?" "I didn't see anything at all, Taicho. Just burned trees and some craters made during Yondaime-sama's fight with the QB." Their leader just blinked at that, and with most of his face covered by the mask he always wore, both Anbu had a difficult time trying to guess what was on his mind. Nevertheless, it seemed they would be able to go home early that night unless Kakashi had them patrol their sector again. Tora and Izuna gulped silently at the prospect of spending the next hour scanning the woods in search of a threat one more time. "In that case, you can return to the village," Kakashi finally said, making both of his subordinates smile behind their masks in relief. "I'll finish here and inform Hokage-sama in the morning." "Hi. Thank you, Taicho." And with that, both disappeared in whirls of smoke and leaves. The young captain stared for a moment at the place where Tora and Izuna had been before vanishing from sight, before letting out a sigh. He could feel their anxiety and subsequent relief as he allowed them to leave, something he thought weren't appropriate feelings for a shinobi, performing the important duty of protecting the village and everyone in it. Maybe he was being too demanding. Or maybe they hadn't had enough time to rest and recover from the sudden attack to the village days ago. Either way, Kakashi knew he'd have to talk to the Sandaime about it. The boy proceeded then to shake his head and prepare himself to move on, though not before turning his head upwards, his dark eye gazing at the many constellations that adorned the sky and stretched for as far as he could see. It was truly fascinating how something could be so far away from mankind's reach and yet so mesmerizing and intriguing. Kakashi was not used to contemplate them, being busy all the time and focusing on the task at hand. But on those rare occasions that nobody was around, he'd stare at the bright tiny dots, thinking about his past, his present and the future. Also, and when he was alone, he'd visit Rin's and Obito's graves at the cemetery, where he'd speak to them about anything he felt like would be interesting. Their deaths had affected him in more ways than he thought possible. And after his sensei passed away he had nothing left except his own will of fire that burned brightly for the village. Like before, the Anbu captain sighed quietly and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to erase the memories of a better past with his friends and sensei from his mind. But as soon as his globes gazed once again at the marvelous sight in the sky above, something that had not been there before caught his attention. It was some sort of orange star, one that seemed to be in movement if the tiny trail of reddish-orange it left behind was anything to go by. Kakashi's eyes narrowed slightly as he focused on the celestial body that flew across the sky, always to the left. He'd heard of those once from a child in the village on his way back home. The girl, holding her mum's hand, who had pointed a little finger at the space and shouted. "Akasan, look. A shooting star. Can I ask a wish?" Kakashi had found it pathetic how parents told their children that celestial bodies flying from one point to another in space could make any of their wishes come true. Their efforts to keep their innocence only delayed the inevitable. Those children would eventually find out that in real life, stars couldn't and wouldn't help you. Dreams do not come true by magic. If you wanted something, and it was something possible to accomplish, you to work hard to make it real. He didn't recall being like those children who clasped their hands together and muttered their inner desires with all the strength they could muster. He'd had his eyes open to the cold, merciless truth for as long as he could remember. Even before his father's death he knew what life was about. The young teen soon grew bored and decided to call it a night, but suddenly the shooting star he was staring at changed its course, turning towards him and spontaneously expanding itself. He continued to watch in silence as the celestial body kept on getting bigger until it reached the size of a cylindrical sphere, moving towards the surface at unusually high speed. What he noticed was a blazing meteorite, or something similar, reached the atmosphere in mere seconds and continued to descend, flying past his position to the eastern part of the forest surrounding the village, more than halfway to the border with the Hotwater land in Umegakure. Kakashi's eyes widened as he prepared to move. He needed to make sure the meteorite, or whatever that was, didn't land near a town or anything. If he recalled correctly, in that direction stood the city of Tensho, famous for its agricultural products. As he dashed forward, Kakashi focused his chakra onto his legs in an effort to shorten the distance that separated him from the flying object before it crashed. He moved with all the speed he could muster, practically pushing his body to the limits just to reach the meteorite that had moments ago disappeared from his sight, with the treetops hiding it almost entirely. It was only thanks to the orange trace of light the object left behind in its way that the boy was able to follow it through the woods. Soon, the sound of an object crashing loudly with the ground and the earthshake that followed afterwards indicated him that his efforts had been in vain. Kakashi cautiously approached to the site, a kunai in his right hand as he moved, using the shadows to hide himself. What he thought before was a meteorite was lying at the end of a small crater made on the ground after its impact. But the trace of dirt and dust leading to it that showed that the object had touched the surface before stopping inches away from where it first made contact with the surface. The boy was beyond intrigued and shocked, but he easily overcame his initial surprise. And even though he knew that could very well be a trap, he to make sure that the object was not a device created by another village to attack Konoha. As he approached the object, and upon closer inspection, Kakashi noticed that the supposed meteorite was actually a strange-looking transport vessel, made of some kind of metal, with a glass hatch that hided whatever, or whoever, was in the inside. He suddenly had a bad feeling about the whole situation, but he let his curiosity guide him towards the hatch, and he looked through the glass, gasping silently at what he saw. It was a baby. Or what seemed to be one, sleeping calmly inside with a red blanket covering his little body. His hair was short and spiky, with a golden tone that reminded him of Natsuki's own hair. In fact, the boy was like a male version of his sensei's daughter. But how? And most importantly, why was a baby inside of such a strange-looking vessel? His visible eye widened to astronomical levels as his mind suddenly showed him the image of the object falling from the sky. He thought it to be impossible, but yet again he'd never seen such technology before, even if he only got a glimpse of the whole thing. No village or country in the elemental nations could have manufactured something so sophisticated, and Kakashi found himself thinking that this object could have very well come from outer space if what he saw was anything to go by. And his theory gained strength as he noticed the hole in the back of the vessel, from where some smoke could be seen leaking, something that made him think of it as a sort of device that propelled the object upwards with fire or something akin to it. If this was true, then the implications would. His thoughts were interrupted, however, as the sound of oxygen escaping the enclosure of the vessel hit his ears, making him jump backwards and get ready for anything. Soon, he observed, the lowest part of the glass hatch turned upwards until it stood at 90 degrees from the vessel, revealing its contents to the world. Kakashi tensed his muscles and approached the ship once again, taking a quick peek at the inside. A pair of sapphire eyes suddenly met his own, black ones. And the young teen noticed that the baby was pretty much awake and was now staring at him with nothing but curiosity and innocence. "Daddy?" The child spoke in a language he could not understand, but it seemed the blonde boy had mistaken him for his father. Only for a moment though, before he noticed that Kakashi was someone he hadn't seen before. "No, Daddy." And then, just as he finished mumbling those words, his little face twisted into a frown and he cried. Loudly. Desperately calling for the parents he didn't know couldn't hear him. Kakashi, on the other hand, just blinked. Twice. He just stood there, kunai in hand and eyebrows furrowed in slight confusion, as the baby bawled his eyes out. For a few moments he kept his eyes fixed on the baby, mildly annoyed by the screams of it. And it was not after some time that he reacted, making some hand seals and placing his hands on the ground. Kuchiyus no jutsu. In a puff of smoke, a small pug-like dog with brown fur and a dark brown snout and ears appeared before him, wiggling his tail slowly with a bored expression on his face. "Yo, Kakashi. It's been some time." The young Anbu nodded in silence, pointing a finger at the baby who was now standing against the vessel's compartment and looking excitedly at the dog, not crying anymore. "I need some help, Pakun," Kakashi observed with an amused eye smile, how the blonde tried to reach the animal with his tiny fingers, much to Pakun's annoyance. "I'm no babysitter, kid. I'm a ninkin in case you haven't noticed." The dog then noticed the strange metallic object that lied next to him and the crater in which it resided, along with the broken trees and other flora that had been destroyed as the result of some sort of impact in the area. "Hey, what's with that thing? Did it fall out of the sky or something?" But Kakashi simply ignored him. "I want you to deliver a message to Hokage-sama. Tell him to meet me at Konoha's main gates in about an hour alone." It was half an hour later that Kakashi arrived at the village, carrying a now sleeping baby in his arms. He'd fallen asleep sometime after the Anbu passed a clearing in the forest near his patrol area, getting tired of sobbing and crying for his parents. The Anbu captain felt grateful that such had been the case, or else he'd have attracted undesired attention on his way to the village. The Sandaime Hokage was waiting for him at the gates, with Pakun by his side. His figure partially illuminated by the moon above, though most of his visage remained hidden below the pointed hat he always wore on his head. As he approached them, Kakashi nodded to Pakun, who disappeared in a whirl of smoke, planning to ask his summoner about the baby and the strange object he was in later. "Kakashi, I heard from Pakun that you've some news." It didn't take long to Sarutobi to notice the bundle on the Anbu's arms and the fact both his cheeks were red from crying and full of dried tears. "Hi, Hokage-sama. Though I believe it would be better if we spoke somewhere with enough room for an object of considerable size. There's something I want to show you, but nobody else must be present when I do." Hiruzen nodded. That ought to be reason why Kakashi had sent Pakun ahead to have him wait outside the village instead of just meeting at his office. Though, he couldn't help but wonder what could be so important so as to being requested to talk in private. The old man knew he'd eventually find out, but he assumed it had something to do with the blonde baby that slept on Kakashi's arms. "We can go to the Hokage's mansion's main hall. It should suffice." With only a mere nod as a response, both shinobi disappeared in whirls of smoke and leaves, reappearing seconds later in front of a magnificent three-story building that looked recently built and decorated, even though it dated from the time of the Shodaime Hokage. Sarutobi led Kakashi through the main entrance, down a long corridor with doors at each side up to a spacious hall with 2 couches at one side, a small bookshelf and a simple table in front of the seats. That place had seen better days, but with Hiruzen being the sole occupant, it was clear he preferred simplicity. As both took a seat on the couches so that they would face each other, Hiruzen pulled out a small pipe from his robe, lighting it moments later before puffing on it. Some seconds went by in which the young boy moved his gaze from Sarutobi to the baby and then to the old Hokage again. Sarutobi exhaled a mouthful of smoke in the form of a small ring before speaking. "Well then, why don't you start telling me where and under what circumstances did you find that baby? Afterwards, I'd like to see the object you spoke about before. Before that, I'd like to request that everything I'm about to tell you, Hokage-sama, doesn't leave this room." If the Sandaime was curious before, now Kakashi had his full attention. That the Anbu asked for such secrecy could only meant that what he intended to tell him was extremely important. Of course. "You have my word." To further prove that he was serious, Sarutobi made a hand seal with one hand and activated the privacy seals distributed all around his house. The prodigy of the leaf nodded before beginning with his story. He told him how he'd stopped to contemplate the stars for a moment after dismissing the Anbu on his team, how he noticed then what at first thought was a shooting star, but later seemed to be a meteorite approaching his position, and how he chased after it in an effort to try to stop it before it collided with the ground. Kakashi then shifted a bit uncomfortably in his seat as he moved to the part that still shocked him, finding out that the meteorite from before was actually a kind of transport that carried a blonde baby inside who appeared to speak a different and unknown language. In the end, he concluded, "I decided to seal the object into a scroll and carry the boy all the way here. I didn't want to risk other shinobi finding it before you arrived, even if I decided to use a genjutsu to conceal everything. I thought it'd be the safest choice." The pensive nod from Hiruzen helped him relax from his anxiety a bit as it meant the old man agreed with his course of action. He rarely let something affect him, but this was clearly an extraordinary event, one that he wanted to get to the bottom of. Careful not to blow some smoke at the baby, the old man continued to puff on his pipe for a while, letting his mind absorb everything Kakashi had told him. Never in his life had he been told such an original and incredible story, and yet he believed him. How could he not? Kakashi was one of the most loyal and powerful shinobi in the village, with more missions on his record than most jounin in Konoha. Sarutobi trusted the Anbu captain in the same way Minato had done, perhaps even more. If this is true, and I'm not saying it's not, then the boy may have come from outer space, concluded Kakashi, feeling a chill running down his spine. His visible eye gazed at the still sleeping boy with renewed curiosity and newfound disbelief. It was hard to believe it, but yet everything he'd seen so far destroyed every other idea his mind tried to create so as to prove his prior supposition wrong. "I see," said Sarutobi in a deep, tired voice as he rubbed his temples with his free hand. Minato had chosen the worst time to die, even if it hadn't really been his choice. Though I'll be more inclined to think that some other village has plot something of this magnitude, it'd be foolish of me not to inspect the object you have recovered from the crashing site. Kakashi saw this as a petition from the Sandaime and nodded, asking the old man for permission to lay the baby on the couch. And he did so carefully, observing how the blonde didn't even notice he was not being carried by the Anbu and rested his little arms on either side of his head. Sarutobi smiled slightly at the sight before focusing on the scroll that now lay open on the floor, with Kakashi soon making hand seals. It wasn't long before the poof of smoke created by the Anbu's chakra faded away and a pointy vessel made of metal took its place, making Hiruzen drop his pipe. If Kakashi's story didn't shock him before, he sure was now. Morning had finally arrived. And with it, another day in which civilians and even some shinobi continued with their artist's work in repairing all the damage the village had suffered from the QP's attack. Those who didn't help tried to continue with their usual lives, but the wound was still fresh, and it'd take weeks, months even before everything went back to normal. In the case of Kakashi Hatake, the incident of the QP was the least of his worries at the moment. He was currently at the hospital, standing behind the glass of the newborn's room where only 2 infants lied on their cribs. Just a few hours ago he had witnessed something so rare that he still thought of it as a mere dream, one of those he didn't mind having as it served as a distraction from all his constant brooding moments. The boy, who was now inside the room on a crib next to Natsuki Uzumaki, had been taken to the hospital by himself and the Hokage after the latter had finished deciding what the best course of action would be. Sarutobi had told the nurses the boy had been found by Kakashi inside a destroyed house, crying for his parents who apparently were shinobi that passed away protecting the village. When they asked for a name, he simply told them. His name is Naruto. His following explanation to the young Anbu regarding his decision to use that name slightly shocked him. Minato and Kishino always said that they would call their baby Naruto if it was a boy and Natsuki if it was a girl. Minato was a great fan of Jiraiya's first novel, The Tale of the Utterly Gutsy Shinobi, and loved the idea of calling his unborn son after the story's hero. Kakashi of course knew little about the legendary Sannin, not having met him before in his life. Yet, he frequently saw his name in the bookstores he went by to buy more reading material and had always wondered what his novels were about. That his old sensei liked them gave Kakashi a reason to give one a read sometime. Based on the results from some routinary medical examinations done on Naruto, the baby was declared as a healthy 1-year-old boy and Sarutobi had the hospital give him a crib next to Natsuki, where they would stay for a few weeks before moving to the orphanage. Most of the staff seemed against the idea of having the son of unnamed heroes stay in the same room as the demon that caused so much destruction and pain to the people in the village, but they were forced to comply. Sarutobi was the Hokage after all. Kakashi rubbed his neck tiredly as he stood there, eyes still glued to the window. He'd barely slept after the baby was handed to the hospital, not because he was worried, no, but because he felt he was the one that should keep an eye on him at all times, making sure he'd not be a threat to anyone. Even if he was a mere baby who seemed almost identical to most human beings around, Kakashi was not going to let his guard down. If he truly came from space and was an alien of some sort, then Kakashi had to make sure he'd not suddenly attack someone or go crazy. He didn't really like the idea of Naruto being in the same room with Natsuki, but Sarutobi considered the blonde harmless enough. Or so it seemed. Back already, Kakashi. The young Anbu captain dressed in his regular Anbu outfit turned around and bowed slightly, only standing straight when the Sandaime Hokage approached his side, puffing on his pipe as he gazed through the window at the 2 infants. "Hi, Hokage-sama. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Sarutobi just remained silent as he contemplated the scene unfolding in the room. The baby boy, who he'd decided to call Naruto, was standing against the crib's edge, giggling as he gazed at the little girl lying in the crib next to him. 2 pair of eyes that were pretty much alike in tonality, Natsuki's ones being slightly lighter, met, and Naruto would just laugh for no apparent reason at the look of curiosity and innocence in the girl's orbs. The grandfatherly smile found its way to his wrinkled lips, but he didn't try to conceal it from a silent Kakashi. Instead, he said, "I wonder if this was somehow predestined." "Hokage-sama." Kakashi turned to him, confused. The boy may have come from space, but he is not really different to other children when you look at him. From what the doctors have told me, Naruto is a healthy 1-year-old boy. Sarutobi's smile grew significantly larger after noticing how Natsuki would move her arms around excitedly every time Naruto made a funny face to her. And pretty much human in looks and in behavior. Whether or not our suspicions are correct, I plan to have the orphanage take him and Natsuki together. In time, I believe he'll act as the brotherly figure that Natsuki desperately needs. Kakashi's eyes widened slightly. But what if the boy starts developing in a way which could differentiate him from the rest? There's no telling what he could turn into in a few years. We must not forget he may not be from this world. I haven't forgotten about that fact, Kakashi. The Sandaime puffed slowly on his pipe, looking at the Anbu out the corner of his eyes for a moment. However, that theory is yet to be thoroughly proved. I'll have some experts bepize the object you found him into, without telling them where and under which circumstances we came across it. His eyes closed for a few seconds in which he gathered his thoughts. And besides, I have a feeling the boy will prove you wrong. The Anbu captain grudgingly inclined his head, diverting his eyes from the Hokage. "Hi, Hokage-sama. For the time being I want you to watch those 2, protect them if you must." Hiding the upper part of his visage under the tip of his hat, Sarutobi turned around and started to walk down the corridor that led to the entrance. "Oh, and Kakashi. Hi. Good job." But the smile slowly finding its way through to his lips behind the mask, the young teen watched as the Hokage disappeared from his sight behind a wooden door, leaving him and two babies behind. Life had suddenly become more interesting for Kakashi Hatake. Dawn came particularly early that morning, with the sun casting its rays of orange-reddish light over Konohagakure no Sado and the forest that surrounded it, creating an amalgam of colors so breathtaking that anyone already up at that hour would have stopped to bask in the sight. For most people it meant time to wake up and get to work, as the village needed repairs done after the destruction inflicted upon it by pain. For some others, like Naruto and Natsuki Uzumaki, dawn meant time to return home and get ready to help the workers in whatever way possible. To get up before dawn and train for long periods had always been their routine since they were but children, and it had been those training sessions which got them so far. After all, together they had managed to defeat Pain and his 6 paths, eventually confronting the Gado, who controlled the minions that ran havoc and destruction among the village. Without the level they had managed to acquire over the years and their recently developed Senjutsu, to defeat someone like Pain would have been a titanic task. Currently, both were walking home after their training spar, which ended up with Natsuki being the victor. Something that didn't happen very often. In fact, it rarely ever happened, despite the fact they were both on the same level, with Natsuki having more chakra, Naruto would usually end up winning. But that day had been different. Naruto had barely managed to keep up with her during the fight, leaving himself open to her attacks more often than usual. And Natsuki noticed something must have been wrong with him. But he kept silent most of the walk home unnerved her. So mind telling me what happened back there? Naruto stuffed his hands on his pockets and kept his side ahead, watching as some carpenters were already starting to work on some of the buildings that had been destroyed during the attack. I don't know, he began, and this time he glanced at his sister, who was looking intently at him. I've been feeling kind of weird ever since we defeated Pain. What do you mean? If Natsuki was curious before, now she was confused. She wondered why she hadn't noticed that her Itachi was not feeling well until then, given the fact she practically never left his side. Being her sister, she and Naruto spent most of their time together, during and out of training, even when they helped around the village, that she overlooked something related to her Itachi meant she was getting bad at reading him. Her brother simply sighed, closing his sapphire eyes in thought. He wondered whether he should tell her or not, though he quickly made up his mind. Naruto knew her better than anyone else, and unless he told her what was wrong with him, she wouldn't let the matter go. Since the attack I've started to hear things I couldn't hear before. Like them, Naruto suddenly stopped and pointed at 2 workers, who happened to be Tazuna and his grandson, Inari, building a door with wooden planks. They stood at a good distance, out of hearing distance. And even if the girl focused really hard, she could not make out what they were talking about. Inari is telling his grandpa he plans on. Itsuki, moving her blue eyes from their friends from the land of waves to her older brother, blinked at him in wonder. What? He plans on asking you out soon. As I'd let the brat, commented Naruto with a slight frown, one that did not go unnoticed by Natsuki. Said girl stifled a giggle behind her hand and blushed slightly. Her Itachi tended to be a bit overprotective sometimes when it came to boys, but that only made her happy. Ara, would you ask me out before Inari-chan does Itachi? That's not what I meant. She watched with amusement as her brother's face reddened instantly and he shook his arms in denial. It was so easy and funny to embarrass him. What I was trying to say was that he's too young for you and you deserve someone better. Upon noticing the sly look she was sending his way, he shrugged his shoulders. Ah, never mind, he placed his hands on his neck and ignored his sister's eyes, who was now giggling loudly. I'm just messing around with you Itachi, she said as they resumed their walking, the blonde's face slightly red in embarrassment. Though, I wouldn't mind going out with you. Naruto's blush increased tenfold, but didn't say anything. Natsuki just liked to tease him, and she tended to do so at any moment or place. She didn't really mind, as both knew they weren't actual siblings. And besides, she had to admit she found her brother very attractive, with his short, spiky golden hair, his vibrant blue eyes that reminded her of 2 sapphires and his body, which was not bulky but athletic and perfectly trained for his age. He was quite the catch. And she wasn't the only one who thought that. Ever since they returned from their training trip with Jiraiya, more than half of the female population in Konoha had gained interest in him, much to her jealousy. Not only due to him looking more masculine and mature than before, but also to the clothes he would now wear, a sleeveless black jacket with a red spiral on the back over a mesh shirt which showed his well-trained body, a pair of dark blue cargo pants with a kunai holster on his waist and dark ninja sandals. Thankfully, Naruto didn't really seem to notice the looks he got as he walked through the streets of Konoha, since his mind was always focused on training and spending time with his sister and his friends. Yet, he did notice whenever someone would turn to look at Natsuki, who was also quite popular among the male population. Over the years her bright golden hair had grown to a point where she had to tie it in twin tails, though it only made her look more cute in everyone else's opinion. Natsuki was shorter than her brother, but tall enough for her head to reach just above his chest. Her blue eyes were of a lighter shade than Naruto's, and she sported 3 marks like whiskers on each cheek. Her body was athletic, yet she had curves on the right places that, along with her long toned legs and her D-cup breasts, made most males drool at her sight. Her outfit consisted of a short-sleeved red kimono with a black obi around her waist, which reached just above a pair of dark thigh stockings and black ninja sandals. Everything hugged her gorgeous figure perfectly, much to most of the male population's happiness. Natsuki shook her head to break out from her reverie, feeling her pigtails sway with her movements. She then looked at Naruto, who was still evading her look. Jokes aside, she began, "Are you sure you're not using chakra to enhance your hearing ability?" It was then that her brother forgot about his previous embarrassment and turned to glance at her with one of his eyebrows raised. "No. If I had, I would have picked up more sounds at the same time, and yet, I can easily focus on a specific source." Natsuki's facial expression dropped slightly, something that told him she had a hard time believing him. "And that's not all. If I concentrate on a surface, I can see through it." His sister watched in silence as he fixed his eyes on the wall of a newly built house and stood still. After a few seconds, he said, "It's pretty much empty on the inside, except for a table with 4 varnished wooden chairs, a couch, and a photo of a young woman with violet hair standing next to wait, I remember that guy. He was the proctor of the Chunin exam preliminaries." Natsuki's eyes widened in shock. "You mean Hate-sensei?" "Yeah." He nodded, grinning for a second. Wonder who that girl is, she seems familiar though." His sister, however, still found it hard to believe that Naruto had gained those abilities out of nowhere. But he was her beloved Itachi, the one who had never lied to her about anything, the only person that stood by her side after the Sandaime died. Deep down she knew he was telling the truth. But it didn't stop her from pouting cutely and crossing her arms over her chest. Does that mean you have been peeping on me or other girls when undressing or taking baths?" "Itsuki-chan." Naruto hid his head in his palms, blushing furiously. "Could you please not joke about this? It's serious." The girl soon dropped her fake act and grinned at him. "Teehee. Sorry Itachi, you just look so cute when embarrassed," much to her amusement, Naruto groaned. Lately, she'd been teasing her brother more often. "But getting back to our topic, do you think this is a kind of Kekkei Genkai you're beginning to develop just now?" Naruto sighed. He couldn't deny feeling a bit apprehensive about the whole matter. It was possible that his dead parents belonged to a clan in the Leaf whose Kekkei Genkai consisted on enhanced hearing and vision. Though he'd never read or heard about such a clan before. He thought maybe he could go to the library after Team 7's meeting in the afternoon and try to find something about who his parents may have been. Something he thought would be truly difficult as he didn't even know his own last name. Sarutobi, who probably was the only one that knew the truth about it, had been long dead by then. The boy doubted Tsunade knew anything about his parents or the clan he belonged to, or if he indeed belonged to any clan in particular. The only person he thought he could ask was Kakashi, who had actually been close to the Sandaime. "Hey, Itachi, Earth to Naruto. Itachi, you there?" Naruto shook his head and turned back to his sister, who he noticed was looking at him with worry. "Yeah, sorry about that. I was just thinking about going to the library. I want to see if I can find something about my supposed Kekkei Genkai. Then I'll be going with you. The library has tons of books about clans, and I'm sure you'll need my help." "Thanks Natsuki-chan." After rubbing his neck in embarrassment, he pointed forward and they resumed their walk, passing by Tazuna and Inari who waved at them with grins. The latter staring a bit longer at Natsuki, specifically at her chest. And while she didn't seem to notice, Naruto did. An angry frown took over his expression as he glared at the boy, jealousy flowed through him for a moment until Natsuki hugged his right arm with hers. The girl smiled in secret glee as he watched her brother blush, not caring in the slightest about the looks they attracted upon them. After both siblings had helped around the village a bit, immensely speeding the repairments by using Kage Bunshin, they had been summoned to Training Ground 3, the one in which they'd become part of Team 7 years ago. At the moment, both Natsuki and her brother were sitting against a tree, her head rested against Naruto's shoulder as the latter was in a deep trance. Meditation had always been part of his training routine, as it helped him relax his body and focus his chakra to different parts of his body. It was a good chakra control exercise in his opinion, though it required patience and, above all, no interruptions from the outside. And until then every member of Team 7 present at Training Ground 3 had remained silent, much to the young man's satisfaction. Though all things, especially good ones, tend to come to an end eventually, and Naruto knew it. "Kakashi-sensei is late again. Ugh, this is so annoying." Sakura suddenly screamed, standing up from the ground as she couldn't stand the silence anymore. She was never one to let others enjoy peace and quietness, Naruto and Natsuki thought in annoyance, the former outwardly wincing. Her voice hurt his hearing even more now that he'd acquired the ability to hear things from afar. I could be at the hospital helping the staff right now, instead of wasting my time waiting for our lazy sensei. Well, your desire to help others is commendable, Sakura, Naruto began as he slowly opened his azure orbs, complaining will not make Kakashi arrive sooner. He's been late for team meetings practically ever since we first met him. Instead, you could be doing some light training like I'm doing. You should try to improve your patience a bit. The aforementioned turned to look at him with an angry frown, though he didn't let it bother him. Nobody asked for your opinion, Naruto. It was only a suggestion, take it or leave it, I don't really care, said the blonde with a shrug, closing his eyes so as to make it seem he was going back to his meditations. Sakura opened her mouth to complain, but Natsuki decided to speak before she could. And Aichin is right. Even if you're physically stronger than both of us, you tend to let your impatience and anger get the best of you, which could cost our team the upper hand in a difficult battle. That's not true. As your teammates, we just want to help you, Naruto said, his tone a bit softer than before. The better we operate as a team, the better we'll handle our fights together. Alright. To her credit, the pink-haired Chunin shut her mouth and nodded, blushing slightly in embarrassment. Both siblings looked at each other and smiled. Sakura could actually admit when she was wrong, even if it only meant inclining her head in shame. And it was right in that moment that Kakashi made his entrance, appearing in the center of the training ground in a swirl of leaves and smoke. His visible eye scanned the area, noticing that everyone, except Sai, who now worked as an independent jounin, was present. Naruto and Natsuki nodded in acknowledgement at him, yet the pink-haired girl refused to meet his eye for some reason he ignored. Did something happen before I arrived? It was Natsuki who answered, winking an eye at him. We are not telling you unless you tell us the reason why you're always late. Kakashi smiled at that. Of course they were hiding something from him, yet he didn't consider it to be important enough for him to tell them about his secret visits to Rin's and Minato's graves. It didn't really matter, he was probably going to find out later, he thought. Me? I believe I always explain the reason why I'm forced to be late. Kakashi watched in amusement as not only both siblings, but also Sakura turned to look at him with looks of irony. Sometimes I get lost on the path of life or a black cat crosses my path and I'm forced to go the long way. On certain occasions, though, I find an old lady who needs help with her shopping bags. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that as he heard Sakura cracking her knuckles with an angry smile. She was clearly pissed at his pathetic attempt of an excuse. And you actually believe that crap? Believe or not, life can be tough sometimes, he said, ignoring the killing intent that slowly poured out from Sakura. But enough about me. Today we'll have an special training. And that would be the jutsu training. He announced with an eye smile, much to the joy of his pink-haired student. That was practically her favorite way to train, since it meant she could use her inhuman strength to obliterate her opponent. She inwardly hoped she was paired against Kakashi to teach him a lesson for having them wait so long for him to arrive. And we'll work in pairs. Naruto, you will go against me. Then Pinky and Blondie will follow. Upon hearing the news, the young man smirked, he was getting to try his abilities against his sensei. That would surely pose a good challenge, and he was actually going to focus 100% on the battle this time, not like he did against Natsuki during their morning training. Natsuki, on the other hand, pouted at not having the chance to fight Kakashi, something that was shared by Sakura, who groaned silently. Though, as both girls turned to glance at each other, they couldn't help but grin. This was actually the first time they'd fight each other in training, and it thrilled them to no end. After Naruto's sister nodded at him with a cute smile and wished him luck, both she and Sakura got out of the way, standing against a nearby tree from where they could watch the match unfold. To say they were intrigued with the battle's outcome would be an understatement. After all, Naruto had proved himself in the battle with Pain as one of the most powerful shinobi of Konoha, along with Natsuki. Yet Kakashi was not considered an S-rank jounin for nothing. Alright, this will be a Taijutsu-only fight. No ninjutsu or genjutsu allowed. However, we can still use kunai, shuriken or any other weapon of our choice. Naruto nodded, standing at a good distance from his sensei with an enthusiastic grin. Kakashi had to actually admit he felt somewhat excited. Not every day he'd get the chance to fight against his own disciple, one of the two shinobi who had managed to defeat Pain and save the village from complete destruction. Kakashi wondered whether he'd need his Sharingan in battle, as it didn't count as ninjutsu. By the way Naruto seemed ready to use his full power, the ex-Anbu felt like he'd need to go all out from the very beginning. Well, he began, taking a pause as he fell into a fighting stance, deciding not to reveal his sharing for the time being. Naruto did the same, and soon he adopted his Toad-style stance. Begin. The Jounin had barely time to react, less register what happened, as the blonde had shortened their distance in a millisecond, crashing right into his sensei and sending him flying into a tree, much to everyone's surprise. Kakashi's body disappeared in a puff of smoke as the impact broke the tree and made it fall to the ground. Whoa. As Naruto gasped in shock at the speed he'd moved with, especially without using any chakra to reinforce his legs, the real Kakashi watched the blonde from behind some bushes in the training ground, both his eyes widened as he lifted the headband hiding his Sharingan from view. He had not expected Naruto to show such speed, even though the boy was faster than most shinobi in the village. And there was no way he couldn't have seen his attack coming, barely having time to switch himself with a Kage Bunshin before the boy literally crashed against him. Kakashi was a trained Jounin, one that had fought against thousands of enemies in his life and survived each encounter. And Naruto, it seemed, was as surprised as he was with his previous display of strength and speed. That was unexpected. Meanwhile, Natsuki and Sakura were looking at the blonde Chunin with widened eyes, their minds trying to register what they had just seen. Since when could Naruto do that? Natsuki was at a loss for words, as was Naruto, who was suddenly forced to tilt his head to his side to avoid being hit by a kunai thrown at him. Kakashi decided to make his presence known once again and reappeared in front of the blonde, throwing a barrage of fists and kicks that quickly put Naruto on the defensive. Naruto blocked a blow aimed at his head and countered with his right fist, something that was easily dodged by Kakashi as he ducked below the attack and threw a low roundhouse kick to the blonde's knee. The young teen jumped backwards and suddenly dashed forward, throwing a punch at his sensei with all the strength he could muster. When Kakashi tried to block it, hoping he could then counterattack, he was surprisingly sent flying back at immense speeds, crashing right into a tree and then into another before he was able to stop, his bones painfully cracking to a point where the silver-haired ninja thought they would break. Fortunately for him, that didn't happen. Yet he couldn't help but cough in pain behind his mask, something that managed to shock both girls and Naruto to the core, their eyes nearly bulging out their skulls. "Naruto? How did you?" The blonde turned to Sakura, a look of uncertainty visible on his face. I don't know." Itsuki, on the other hand, had gone from astonished to impressed. Her light blue globe sparkling with excitement as she placed both hands on her whiskered cheeks. "And Aichin, that was awesome. You hit even harder than Sakura. I didn't know you possessed such strength." The pink-haired girl pouted in jealousy, yet she couldn't help but agree with the blonde. The only one who had a strength similar to her own was Tsunade-sama, and she didn't recall seeing her teammate going through the same training she'd done. Hell, she'd never seen him hitting someone with that power before. To her surprise, Naruto actually looked as confused as they were. The look of surprise still present on his visage. "Me neither, in fact, I..." Whatever he wanted to say next never came out of his throat as the three members of Team 7 saw Kakashi walking up to them, having recovered from his initial shock and the state Naruto left him in. He covered his Sharingan with his forehead protector before turning to Natsuki and Sakura and saying, "Training is over. You can go home." "But sensei," Sakura began, confused as to why Kakashi looked so serious. "What about our fight?" She gestured to her fellow blonde as she spoke. "Some other time. There's something I need to speak with Naruto." The pink-haired girl would have complained under normal circumstances, but the look on Kakashi's face left no room for argument. Even Natsuki, who initially planned on staying with them, decided to leave them alone and interrogate her brother afterwards. "I'll be home if you need me, Anaichin," Natsuki said as she and Sakura shunshined away, leaving a nervous teen and a silent adult behind. Both stared at each other just for a few seconds, even though for Naruto it seemed like minutes had passed since Kakashi finally blinked and spoke to him, using a tone he barely ever heard him use before. "I want you to explain to me what happened back there. Have you focused your chakra on your arms or legs to make yourself faster or stronger?" "No," answered Naruto slowly, something that didn't seem to surprise Kakashi at all. "When I sent your clone flying into that tree I just ran to you, trying to land a surprise attack. Yet, as soon as I started moving I found myself suddenly colliding with your body." Kakashi's only visible eye widened in astonishment. "You mean you couldn't control yourself and crashed into me because of the speed you moved at?" "I think so," he folded his arms nervously over his chest. "And when you tried to block my attack I wasn't expecting the impact to send you flying away. I mean, I've never punched someone so hard before in my life. I believe I may be developing a Kekkei Genkai." "The Kekkei Genkai?" Kakashi repeated with incredulity. "Naruto." "And that's not all," the ex-Anbu was interrupted as the young man decided to tell his sensei about his other newfound abilities. "I've been able to hear things that are out of a normal people's hearing range for the past few days. And I can also see through walls if I put my mind onto it. Natsuki knows it's true, I've proved it to her." Kakashi opened his mouth and immediately closed it. He was at a loss for words, mainly because he honestly wasn't expecting Naruto to develop abilities that few or even no shinobi possessed after everything that had transpired since he found him in that spaceship. What Naruto was going through probably had to do with the fact that he was from another world, a theory he and the Sandaime had thought about during the first few years of the blonde's life in Konoha. Though after watching him for many years, he'd finally thought the boy was like any other shinobi, a prodigy yes, but not different in an outworldly way. "Sensei, you know what's happening to me, don't you?" Naruto suddenly asked after feeling like he'd waited long enough. He noticed how his sensei seemed to tense at that and pressed on. "If my guessing is correct, then my parents must have belonged to a specific clan in the Leaf. But which one, exactly?" Kakashi, instead of answering right away, shook his head, sighing afterwards. "I think I may have a theory about why you're developing those abilities." As soon as the blonde's face brightened with hope, his sensei raised a hand and prevented him from speaking. "But before I explain it to you, there's something you should see. Meet me at Tsunade-sama's tent in an hour. If you wish you can bring Natsuki with you." And without giving the blonde a chance to reply, Kakashi vanished from sight, leaving a very confused and thoughtful Naruto behind. "Ani, do you think you'll finally get to learn about your parents?" Naruto sighed in an effort to calm his rising nerves. For the past minutes, he and his sister had been waiting outside the Gondaime's Hokage tent, with Shizune keeping an eye on Tsunade in the inside, as the blonde woman had been in coma ever since Pain's invasion. Itsuki was as surprised as he was after finding out that Kakashi indeed knew something about the reason why he'd manifested enhanced hearing and other abilities he didn't know he had until then. Like the newfound strength he used against his sensei in their short fight. Turning to look at his beautiful little sister, he smiled. "I truly hope so, Natsuki-chan. Maybe my parents were renowned shinobi like your dad, the Yondaime Hokage, and belonged to a clan that possessed a Kekkei Genkai like mine." The girl returned the smile with one of her own and grabbed his hand, giving it an affectionate squeeze. She had found the identity of her father during the battle against Pain, with the man stopping her from releasing the seal on the QB. And to know she was the daughter of one of the most powerful shinobi to have ever existed on the nations filled her with a sense of pride and joy. "Well, everyone always said your parents were heroes. Heroes who sacrificed themselves for the village during the QP's attack. Whether they were part of a clan or not, what they did showed their love for the village and for you, and Aichin. I'm sure they must be proud of you for everything you've achieved so far." The grin found its way to Naruto's lips as he heard that, nodding to the girl who felt butterflies flying in her belly. He'd lie if he said he hadn't been feeling nervous at all before, but now he was put at ease. Whoever his parents may have been, he'd always think of them as saviors and heroes. Both siblings remained in silence after their little exchange, watching as people passed by and waved at them with smiles, something they returned happily. People were finally acknowledging not only Naruto, but Natsuki as well as true shinobi, getting over their initial hate towards her and the Bijuu trapped inside her body. "Hey. Naruto. Natsuki." The voice of none other than Ino Yamanaka suddenly broke the comfortable silence settled over them, and they turned their heads towards the source of the sound. Two pairs of azure eyes glanced upon the famous Ino-Shikacho trio, approaching their position with grins. "Yo. Ino-chan, Shika-kun, Choji-kun," greeted Natsuki, a kind smile on her face as she spoke. "What's up with you two? We haven't seen you in forever." Naruto shrugged at Ino's question, noticing how Choji decided to open a bag of chips he carried on his hand. He was thinner than he remembered him to be, probably due to how much chakra he'd used in the fight against Pain and the Six Paths. If the Akimichi clan didn't need to rely on fat for their special ninjutsu, he told Choji to stop eating so as to keep fit. "Yeah, well, we've been training a lot lately." Shikamaru casually rolled his eyes at that. "Heh, you two have followed the same training routine ever since we were kids. Maybe what you meant was you've been busy cloning yourself to help around if the Narutos and Natsukas we've seen around the village are something to go by." "You got me there," the blonde raised his hands in a defeated manner, making the rest chuckle. "Though Natsuki-chan and her clones have practically done all the work. Her chakra reserves are way bigger than mine, after all. Which makes me more powerful than you and Aichin. Whatever helps you sleep at night, my beloved Amato." The Ino-Shikacho trio watched in amusement as Natsuki pouted and playfully swatted his arm, with him frowning in mock pain. Both blondes had always been like that ever since they started classes at the academy, showing to share a bond rarely seen in two people with no actual blood relation. It was like they were true siblings. "So," Ino began, smiling slyly as her eyes moved from Naruto to his sister. "Are you two on a date right now?" Surprisingly enough, not only Naruto's face turned red crimson, but also Natsuki, who started to play with her fingers in a nervous manner. Though while her brother starting to sputter in denial, she kept silent. "No. We are just waiting for Kakashi-sensei to arrive." "Yeah, that's it. Ha ha." By the way, Natsuki's expression twisted into a disappointed pout for a second, and the young man's nerves, it was clear for Ino that something else was going on between those two. Her smile grew wider, she'd always shipped those two, especially since they would make such a cute couple in her opinion. "Ara, I never thought you had it in you, Naruto-kun." "Leave them alone, Ino," Shikamaru said, ignoring the grateful smile on Naruto's face and the way in which Ino giggled slyly. Choji, meanwhile, just munched on his chips, not really feeling he needed to say anything for the time being. "You said you were waiting for Kakashi-sensei." His old friend nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah. He said he's something important to show me. I think it may be related to my newfound Kekkei Genkai." Upon hearing his words, the three members of Team 8 widened their eyes in shock. Choji swallowed a mouthful of chips sonorously before he decided to formulate the question everyone, except for both siblings, had been meaning to ask for the past few seconds. "You have a Kekkei Genkai. How did you find out?" "Well, maybe it'd be best if we tell them some other time," said Natsuki, knowing that Kakashi was due to arrive at any moment. Four sets of eyes turned to look at her, and she shrugged her shoulders. "It's actually a long story." "Ha. No way. I want to know." Naruto awkwardly rubbed the back of his head and smiled at his friends. They were really curious about his newfound abilities, even Shikamaru seemed interested. And he couldn't blame him, after all, not every day you find out that a fellow shinobi with no last name and deceased parents may actually belong to a clan that possessed a Kekkei Genkai. "How about we go to Yakiniku-Q for lunch tomorrow? I promise we'll tell you everything." At the prospect of going to his favorite place, Choji raised a fist in the air and grinned, a glint appearing in his eyes as he did so. "Yeah. We should definitely do that. We can even tell the rest of the gang to join us. Like Hinata-chan, Kiba, Shino, Niji, Lee, Tenten, Sakura and Sai if you want to," said Naruto, shivering at the mere mention of Sai, someone he considered a weirdo in many ways. Yet, he thought mentioning his name would convince Ino, who seemed anxious enough to disagree with the idea, and have them tell her about such succulent details on the blonde's heritage. "That way, I can announce it to everyone in one go." Ino finally relented and sighed, pointing a finger at Naruto immediately afterwards. "Fine, but you better show up tomorrow or I'll find you and drag you there myself." "Right," Naruto silently gulped before nodding his head in agreement. Shikamaru and Natsuki sweat dropped at the scene unfolding before them, with the former muttering troublesome woman under his breath. Choji just shrugged his shoulders. "Ino could be a pain in the ass sometimes. I apologize for having you receive us in Tsunade-sama's tent, Shizune-san. But your presence is required, after all." "It's no problem at all, Kakashi-san," the woman replied, putting a strand of black hair behind her ear. Kakashi had asked her to be present as she would be the one to share Hotaki's information with the Hokage after she woke up, and though it'd have been easier to have them meet at Naruto's apartment, Shizune couldn't really leave her teacher's side. She was the only one who could monitor her, after all. "I'd offer you three some tea, but I'm afraid I've run out of it." Kakashi smiled at her politeness. "Don't worry about that. In fact, I don't think any of us would be feeling like having a cup of tea when we begin this little meeting." His words greatly unnerved Naruto, who suddenly felt like he'd be learning some kind of a secret from Kakashi. Shizune and Natsuki just widened their eyes in surprise, but kept their cool. If they were curious before, now they were intrigued. After all, to ask Tsunade's disciple to receive them in the same place where a very old-looking Gondaime Hokage rested could only mean that whatever Kakashi wanted to tell them was of the utmost importance. The black-haired woman wondered for a moment if the scarecrow was about to share something that could very well change Naruto's life for the better. Or for worse. Kakashi let out an anticipatory breath and zipped the tent's entrance, preventing any passerby from taking a peek inside. Then, he walked to the other side and stood facing one of the walls for a moment as he mentally prepared himself for what was to come. Despite what many could think, Tsunade's tent was actually quite big, almost as big as the small living room at the siblings' apartment. Something that thereby allowed him to open a scroll on the floor, kneel down and make some hand seals. Yet, before he proceeded to summon the object sealed inside, he tilted his head towards Naruto, who was watching silently as were the others. "Naruto. Sensei. I want you to promise me that no matter what I show or tell you, you'll hear me to the end. I can assure you that, as your sensei, I'll only speak with the truth." Naruto nodded with slight disdain, slightly confused as to what could be so hard to believe that would make him leave before Kakashi was over. "I promise." And immediately after he heard that, Kakashi poured some chakra into the scroll and allowed the metallic object to be released from its confines in a puff of smoke. When everyone in the room had a clear sight of it, they widened their eyes. But only for a moment though. Itsuki was the first to frown in confusion, tilting her head cutely to a side before asking, "And what's that supposed to be?" Kakashi stood up and carefully placed a hand on the rocket, feeling the cold surface against his skin, is where I found you 15 years ago, Naruto. While Shizune gasped and Natsuki's frown changed into a look of surprise, the young man growled. Is this some kind of joke, Kakashi-sensei? Cause if it is, it's not funny. Yet the look on his sensei's face showed he was far from being about to burst in laughter and tell him it was all a prank of some sort. In fact, Naruto and his sister noticed he'd been carrying the same expression on his visage ever since he walked up to them after crashing into not one, but two trees consecutively. But how? This time it was Shizune who voiced her thoughts, as both siblings were still busy trying to comprehend how in the world could a baby be found in such a strange-looking object. She shifted nervously on her seat next to Tsunade's bed as Kakashi's eye met her own, the old Hokage by her side sleeping calmly in spite of the event transpiring at the moment. I was 14 at the time, and yet I have never forgot about that fateful night. And so, the ex-Anbu captain told them everything, from how he was on patrol, when he suddenly saw what he thought was a meteorite flying to Earth, and how he'd chase after it, arriving at the crash site minutes later, only to find out that an 1-year-old Naruto was inside, sleeping comfortably until he woke up. Kakashi proceeded to tell them how he'd put the object into a scroll and carry a baby that kept crying for his parents in a strange language all the way to Konoha, where he met with the Sandaime at his mansion and discussed the prior events with him. He then explained Sarutobi's decision to have Naruto taken to the hospital to be examined by doctors who found nothing wrong with him in any sense and deemed him healthy enough for him to join Natsuki in her room. Kakashi also explained that the Sandaime had some scientists he trusted bepies the ship Naruto arrived in without telling them its origin, with the results of their research showing the object was far too sophisticated to have been produced by anyone in the elemental nations. However, as he was about to continue with the story, Naruto, who had kept his cool so far, interrupted him. Was there anything else inside apart from me? Kakashi nodded his head at that, quickly noticing that despite the looks of utter shock and disbelief in both Kunoichi's faces, the blonde was probably the most composed one. He'd barely widened his eyes and gasped when the Jounin narrated in a detailed way how he had come across Naruto in his youth, as if still refusing to believe in what he heard. When Sandaime-sama first took a look at the insides, we found some blankets and something else. He motioned his student to come closer, something he complied almost reluctantly. Shizune and Natsuki quickly stood up and followed Naruto, eager to get a glimpse at whatever items lied inside the ship. 3 pairs of eyes gazed upon the rocket and didn't even blink when Kakashi opened a small side compartment and pulled a square wooden box with something that resembled a plate on it. Said plate was engraved with strange aleatory markings that seemed to have no apparent meaning, even if they tried to decipher it at first sight. Kakashi held the object on his hands as he turned to Naruto. I've kept this thing ever since Sandaime-sama passed away, but I could never open it. He then handed the object to the blonde, who remained in utter silence, while both Shizune and Natsuki inspected the box with curious eyes. Maybe it only responds to you. And as soon as his fingers came in contact with it, the plate began to blink intermittently before the many markings on it shifted, moving like pieces in a puzzle, and ultimately forming a kind of pentagonal shield with an image that somewhat remembered Naruto of a dragon. Suddenly, the blonde found himself in a wholly different place, yet one that was slightly familiar to him. He immediately gasped and moved his widened eyes around, noticing he was in what seemed to be the main living room of a house, a large couch with curvatures on the backrest. A black wooden table with many chairs of a similar dressing at the center of the room, and pictures and frames of what appeared to be different families all around. Naruto noticed more strange-looking furniture in the room, but what really caught his attention was the huge window panel that connected the house with the outside, revealing a marvelous yet strange world with people flying around on metallic objects, rare houses with roofs that went down and stretched to the ground, and other equally unnerving buildings. Beyond it all, a gigantic reddish sun watched it all, casting its rays in a way that didn't remind the blonde of the sun he knew so well. This one seemed older, weaker even, as if its end would have been near. Hello Jin, a sudden voice at his back alerted the young man, and he took a cautious step back and fell into his fighting stance, ready to defend himself if necessary. What he saw, however, almost made him fall on his butt in shock. I see you've activated the message we left for you in your escape rocket. Even though he could not understand what he was being told, he fully recognized the man that was now addressing him. You are. The man smiled, and so did the beautiful woman with vibrant red hair next to him. It was the Yondaime Hokage, Minato Namikaze. Itsuki, along with Shizune and Kakashi, had been watching in silence as Naruto stood there, eyes blank and immobile, as he seemed to have his mind elsewhere. As soon as he touched the box, a strange light beam had made contact with his forehead, projecting the same shield from the plate on his skin. From that point onwards, she tried calling to him, even touched his shoulder, to see if he was okay. He didn't respond nor did he move at all, standing still in the same position as before. Kakashi had told them that they should wait for whatever Naruto was experiencing right now to be over and then find out what happened. For what seemed like the longest minutes of her life, Natsuki could do nothing but wait. Her anxiety was nearly overflowing, as she didn't like being in the dark about something that involved her most precious person. And especially now after her brother was told to be some kind of an alien that had come into this world in a strange-looking spaceship. The part of her still refused to believe Naruto was not a normal human being like the rest, trying to hold on to logical reasoning, which had long ago been overpowered by Kakashi's explanations and contundent evidence. Said part kept getting weaker as Naruto continued immersed in a trance, only to be eventually replaced with nothing but a deep desire for answers. She, as much as Shizune and Kakashi did, wanted to know what was going on with her brother. It was only when the light beam receded into the box that Naruto came back and blinked several times, trying to process what he'd just experienced. The Naichin. Natsuki felt relief flowing through her body as she approached his side with a worried look. "Are you okay?" But the blonde didn't answer. Instead, his eyes traveled downwards to stare at the ship, where he slowly placed the plate he'd been holding. His sister's face dropped slightly at that, but when she tried to place a comforting hand on his shoulder, he opened his mouth. It was the Hokage. "Naruto-kun?" asked Shizune, not clearly getting what he said as his tone was barely audible. It was the funking Yondaime Hokage. Naruto suddenly snapped, angry eyes turning to glare at a speechless Kakashi. "I saw him." And a red-haired woman who seemed his wife standing by his side at a strange-looking place that was clearly not Konoha. What the hell is going on here? The silver-haired Jounin immediately recoiled under his student's anger. He then raised his hands in a soothing manner. "Calm down, Naruto. You know that's not possible. Yondaime-sama and his wife, Kushina Uzumaki, have been dead for a long time now." Despite being the first time said girl learned about her deceased mother's name, she didn't even react to the news, especially since she knew who her father was, and instead, took a step back, trying not to interfere with his brother who seemed clearly pissed. But mostly shocked. "Oh yeah, and how do you explain both talking to me in a different language? Was he from another world too?" "Naruto," Kakashi began, slightly taken aback. "Minato Namikaze was born and raised within the village, serving it as a loyal shinobi and eventually a Hokage until his death. He's never been missing in his life as a ninja, less abandoned Konoha." Kushina Uzumaki arrived at the Leaf during her childhood, and as the previous Jinchuriki of the QB she protected it like her husband. "What you're saying is impossible." This time, it was Shizune who decided to interfere before things could get out of hand. "It's true, Naruto-kun." Furious sapphire eyes turned to look at her, but she didn't stop. "I met Yondaime-sama a few times during my adolescence, and I know he's lived all his life in Konoha. Maybe what you saw was someone that looked like him and his wife." Much to both adults' relief, Naruto seemed to calm down at that, but he still looked a bit overwhelmed by everything. "I know what I saw. And those people were Natsuki's parents." He shook his head with an ironic smile before turning to leave. "Not mine. Mine are dead." "The Naichin." Naruto ignored Natsuki and turned to leave. However, and before he could do that, he was interrupted by the sound of the vessel being sealed. The blonde looked out the corner of his eyes and noticed that his sensei was presenting him with the same scroll that carried everything which he was supposedly the sole owner of. "Here. This belongs to you." Without uttering a single word, the blonde snatched the scroll from Kakashi's hands and put it in his jacket. Then, and after zipping the tent open, he stuffed his hands in his pockets and left Tsunade's restroom. Kakashi let out a tired sigh and placed a comforting hand on Natsuki's shoulder, who was clearly at the brim of tears. "Kakashi-sensei." Natsuki moved her blue eyes from the tent's entrance to the Jounin. "He just needs some time alone. Time to process everything that he's seen and learned about himself. After all, he has just found out he may actually be an alien from outer space." His words seemed to have an opposite effect on the girl and even on Shizune, noticing how they frowned at him all of a sudden. "If this is true, why didn't you tell him sooner?" Kakashi shrugged. "Sandaime-sama thought it'd be wiser to wait until he was older to give him the news. Though, as time went by, I didn't feel it would be necessary to tell him at all, given the fact he'd barely shown himself to be different from the rest." "You didn't feel it would be necessary to tell him who he really is?" Shizune repeated, clearly not pleased at all with the Scarecrow's decision. "That means that if he hadn't shown any different, you would have decided to keep silent about the whole deal." "I didn't know how he would handle the truth," Kakashi patiently explained, although it seemed nothing he said would appease the angry Kunoichi before him. "Look, both Sandaime-sama and myself wanted Naruto to live a normal life without considering himself as a different being from his friends, his sister and the rest. How would you react if you found out you come from space and weren't born on Earth?" That seemed to calm Shizune and Natsuki somewhat as they understood the Scarecrow's reasons for deciding to hide the truth from him. Still, that didn't justify Kakashi's decision to not tell him at all, since Naruto and anyone else in his same situation deserved to know something of such importance. I still think you should have told him sooner. Itachi has lived his whole life wondering who his parents were and why he was never given a last name. Natsuki pouted sadly at the memories of a young blonde, waking her up at night to tell her about his dream, which involved him meeting his Uckman parents. Naruto would have understood. I know he would have. And without speaking any further, the blonde beauty left the tent, her mind going through everything she had learned so far. For the past few hours, Naruto had been aimlessly walking round the village, ignoring almost everyone he came across. It was dusk already, with the sky growing dark in the distance, and yet the blonde teen seemed in no hurry to stand from his seat at the very same place he had gone when he found his old sensei, Jiraiya, was dead. While his eyes remained fixed on the ground, his mind was working non-stop to try and comprehend what he'd been told so far. Kakashi claimed he was actually an alien sent to Earth 15 years ago in a small space vessel. Yet, if that was true, he couldn't quite understand the reason why he'd be sent to that planet and why his parents, whoever they were, had made that choice. His mind traveled back to his encounter with a man that looked exactly the same as Minato Namikaze, except for his attire, and a red-haired woman who he was sure was his wife, Kushina Uzumaki. From the way both spoke to him, they seemed to know him, even if Naruto couldn't understand a single word of what they said. Maybe Kakashi was right and those weren't the actual Yondaime Hokage and his wife, but aliens that looked just like them. But then, how in the world could it be that those two were his parents? Naruto let out a silent sigh before leaning against the back of the seat. This was just too complicated for him to understand. Maybe if both aliens actually spoke his language in the vision he had, he'd have understood their explanation and the reasons why he saw them after touching the wooden box. If only there was something that could help me understand. The blonde's eyes suddenly widened in realization and he moved his head around, first to the left and then to the right. After making sure nobody was around, he pulled out the scroll Kakashi had given him, placed it on the floor and opened it. Taking a deep breath, Naruto made some hand signs and channeled chakra into the seal, making the same rocket from before appear before his eyes. He then allowed his hands to roam the interior, pulling an old blanket and the wooden box from before aside as he sought for something that could have remained hidden in the ship ever since Kakashi found it. Yet, as his hopes greatly decreased at not finding anything below the mattress, Naruto came in contact with a surface that was smoother to the touch than the metal the ship was made from, and he accidentally moved his finger over a protuberance on the surface, making it move to his side with a click sound. Immediately, something inside the rocket started to hum, quickly turning into a sonorous rumble. Naruto had barely time to remove his hand, afraid of what was going to happen, before a blinding light forced him to cover his eyes behind his palms so as to protect them. Several seconds later the light and the rumbling noise faded away, but Naruto and the rocket were nowhere to be seen. When Naruto finally managed to take his hands off his eyes, he blinked several times to adjust his blurry sight. Upon getting his bearings back, he took a look around and rubbed his eyes, repeating his previous action once again. He soon noticed that he was seeing properly and couldn't help but wonder. Where am I? It was clear he was not in the same place he'd been mere seconds ago. Upon opening his eyes he'd found himself in some sort of alley, with a wired fence behind him connected to two enormous-looking buildings at both sides. A kind of metallic stairwell on the left building's wall led to different windows as it reached a spot near the top of the building. The alley reached some kind of road at the other end, one that the blonde noticed it to be as dark as the night above. From his position he could see that same road being illuminated by lampists at each sides, and even some people walking down the streets, completely ignoring him. Naruto blinked in confusion and decided to use one of his newfound powers, focusing his sight on the building at the right. He narrowed his eyes and looked past the surface, examining the interiors of the house. Everything was dark inside, and yet he could distinguish most of the furniture, thanks to a nearby window that allowed some light to filter in. Apart from some devices that he hadn't really seen before, everything seemed similar to what he had back at his apartment. Yet he knew this was not Konoha, something that got even clearer when he focused his hearing and caught dozens of voices speaking at the same time, but in a language that was practically the same to the one he'd heard the Yondaime and his wife speak in his vision. Such discovery greatly unnerved Naruto and filled his mind with more questions than answers. The one that puzzled him the most was, how did I get here? He knew the vessel must have been the reason why he arrived there, yet his mind couldn't find a possible explanation for what happened. Maybe if I ask around, someone will be able to help me. The blonde doubted that would be case, but what else was he supposed to do? Sit there and wait for something to happen? It's worth a shot. Shrugging, the blonde took a deep breath and took a step forward. Just to realize the very same rocket he'd been inspecting before that blinding light engulfed him had somehow come to that place as well, yet the scroll which Kakashi would often use to seal it was nowhere to be seen. After he frowned for a moment, beginning to suspect that he had accidentally activated something that resulted in his current predicament, Naruto decided to seal the ship inside a small scroll that he conveniently carried in one of his pockets. After all, he couldn't let someone see or steal it while he was busy taking a look around. The young man, as soon as the ship was secured, decided not to waste any more time and exited the alley, allowing his eyes to bask in the new sight that greeted him. An enormous city stretched in all directions, with huge-looking buildings and stores that sold different kinds of products, some similar to the ones he used to see being sold at the village, others completely new to him, and had different-looking signs, all written with letters of a strange and mysterious alphabet. Apart from some people that walked by his side and on the sidewalk opposite to his, mostly ignoring him, his frenetic eyes took notice of metallic kind of boxes with different shapes, transporting people over the dark road that lied between both sidewalks and stretched to the right and to left, in and out the city. Said transports, as he couldn't think of a better way to call them, made noises whenever they moved, and from what he noticed the people inside them seemed to be controlling them by moving a wheel and a kind of handle below. Naruto was greatly astonished by what he saw. Could this be the future? He thought, eyes still moving all around, trying to inspect everything at the same time. A different theory materialized itself in his mind, and the boy wondered about the possibility of the people he saw in his vision being some futuristic version of the Yondaime Hokage and Kushina Uzumaki from his world. Yet he immediately discarded that theory, as his surroundings were still different from the place where the wooden box had taken his mind. I wonder. The blonde shinobi hummed thoughtfully as he moved his head to his side, deep in thoughts. He was quickly pulled out of his reverie when he noticed a very pretty girl younger than him with shoulder-length red hair and azure eyes casually walking in his direction, apparently talking to no one in particular as she held a small, rectangular-shaped box to her ear. "Excuse me?" Naruto called to her, trying to see if she could provide him some of the valuable information he so desperately sought. The shinobi walked up to her and smiled politely. "Can you help me? I'm kind of lost." Said girl suddenly stopped as she noticed someone had decided to stand on her way. Frowning in annoyance, she said, "Hold on Sue, there's an idiot here that's walked up to me. I don't know, he's probably thinking he can hit on me," the girl groaned before addressing the guy in front of her. "Hey, would you please move out of the way? In case you don't know, it's not polite to walk." Whatever she wanted to say next died in her throat as, immediately after she pulled the cell away from her ear and looked upwards, her eyes met with a pair of the most beautiful blue eyes she had ever seen. A pair of puzzling globes that were attached to the masculine and dreamy face of a young man a bit older than her and one that looked confused and lost. "Cute," she thought, putting a strand of red hair behind her ear before smiling cutely. "Oh, hi there. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so rude to you. I thought you were someone else." Naruto blinked at that and tilted his head to his side, not getting any words she'd spoken to him. Yet, he decided to try again. "Hi, can you understand me?" Non-surprisingly, the girl frowned slightly at that, as if confused. "I'm sorry. Is that Chinese or something? 'Cause I don't know how to speak it." "Oh, I guess not." Naruto's features dropped upon coming to the conclusion that probably everyone in the place he was now spoke a different language from the one he knew. The pretty girl seemed to have noticed his disappointment as she tried to speak at a slower pace, in hopes of helping him understand. "Man, this is getting a bit annoying. You don't know how to speak English, do you?" She hummed in thought, trying to come up with a possible solution. "Well, you seem kind of lost. The worst part is my father is at work and I can't really bother him. He may be able to help you, though." As she continued to speak, mostly to herself, Naruto's head suddenly snapped at a point behind the girl from where a sudden sound hit his ears. A scream, a loud piercing yell apparently calling for help that seemed so close yet the boy somehow knew it came from somewhere far away from his position. Someone is in danger. I've to go. Sorry to have bothered you." And with that he suddenly jumped out of the girl's sight, elevating and disappearing into the night. He barely noticed the height he'd reached only by jumping, and less the scream of shock of the red-haired girl that watched him leave. For a few seconds, said girl just stood there, gaping at the fact she had seen a boy slightly older than her make an impossible jump into the sky and disappear from her sight shortly afterwards. The loud noises coming from her cell phone broke her out of her reverie, and she pulled it to her ear again, shaking as she heard her friend still on the other side. "Barb. Barb. I'm here," the red-haired girl eventually mustered enough composure to answer back and immediately let out a sigh when she noticed that, somehow, nobody else around seemed to have seen the strange blonde doing what he did. "Finally. Where were you? I heard you speaking to someone." Her friend, Sue, paused for a moment. "Was it that weirdo that walked up to you?" Barb bit at her lip before she resumed her walking. Can we meet at my house in an hour? You'll never believe what just happened to me. Naruto landed on the roof of a building nearby with feline grace and immediately dashed forward, moving at darting speeds towards the place where he'd heard the voice calling for help. His legs transported him from building to building, and in just a few seconds he found himself in what seemed to be a poorer area of the city, with less stores open and almost no people walking down the deserted streets. All houses and buildings around were closed, with windows covered with wooden planks that hid the dark interiors from sight. In general, the place looked abandoned, but a quick use of his special vision allowed Naruto to see some people around, some dressed in worn-out clothes gathered around fires burning inside cylindrical objects. And others resting inside decrepit houses with little to no furniture. It pained him to see people living in that kind of condition. Another scream, this time a muffled one, brought him back to his current task, and he shook his head, vowing himself to try and help those people after he found some answers and information. Naruto kept on moving through the city as he reached the place where he'd heard someone in distress. Looking down from the edge of an abandoned apartment complex, he saw a kind of alley which was barely illuminated by the moonlight and by a lamppost at one end of it. Yet, what made his blood boil in anger was the group of 4 men that surrounded a naked woman, her clothes nowhere to be seen and her hands tied to her back. She was kneeling against a wall, with her mouth duct taped shut and her legs spread for all the rapists to have a clear sight of her rear. From his position, Naruto noticed how one of her captors held a knife to her throat as another began to pull his pants down, getting ready to rape her first. The others surrounding the trio watched as the woman shed desperate tears and chuckled evilly, most likely waiting for their turns to arrive. Not on my watch. Naruto gritted his teeth in pure anger and disgust and took a step forward, allowing his body to fall from the apartment and head straight to the ground behind the group. The young man landed a second later, making the ground shake and crack under his weight and sheer strength. Sudden yells of surprise made the boy smile as he crouched on the ground, his vision obscured by his own hair. "What the who's that punk?" Said punk slowly stood up and glared at them, watching with barely concealed fury as the man about to rape the woman hurriedly pulled his pants on and screamed something at the others, who pulled some kind of plastic weapon from their vests. "You better leave before things get ugly, kid," warned who seemed to be the leader of the group, a man in his late 40s with ragged jeans, a pair of brown shoes and a black jacket over a white shirt. "You won't be getting a second chance." After a few seconds in which Naruto stood still, face unchanging, the group exchanged looks of temporary disbelief and then chuckled at the blonde's stupidity. They even ignored the fact that merely instants ago said kid had jumped from the building above and cracked the ground with his strength. "Looks like we've got ourselves a brave one, boys. Let's take care of him and have some fun with our beauty over there." Naruto's anger just increased as he watched the one holding a knife to the woman's throat smirk and lick her face hungrily, understanding the meaning behind the leader's words, as his henchmen seemed to yell excitedly at what he shouted before. They were planning to kill him and then have their way with the victim. Unluckily for them, it was going to be the other way around with them dead by the end. He was broken out of his thoughts as what appeared to be tiny cylindrical objects made of some sort of metal flew at high speeds at his body, moving faster than an untrained eye could follow. But Naruto was a shinobi, and as such, he could see them being fired from the plastic weapons on the criminal's hands in slow motion. Naruto just tilted his head to his side and heard the whizzing sound of the objects flying past his ear. When one of them was aimed at his chest, he'd simply tilt his upper body out of the tiny object's way, not moving at all from where he stood. Soon, the firing sound stopped and Naruto watched with a smirk, the looks of utter shock and disbelief on his opponents' faces. It was clear that they weren't expecting that outcome at all, having thought they could easily take him out with their weird weapons. Yet they were no ninja, and only a ninja or someone equal to him in power level could go against the blonde and hope to win. What? How did he do that? Just keep firing, damn it. And after shaking their heads to get rid of their previous shock, the rapists aimed their weapons at him and resumed their firing. This time, instead of just dodging, Naruto suddenly dashed forward, vanishing from sight, only to reappear a moment later and slam a punch to the leader's face that sent him flying onto a nearby wall. The force of the impact knocked him out cold. A sight that made everyone else stop and recoil in fear. Big mistake. Before the other 2 criminals that stood next to their boss could comprehend what was going on, they were taken down in an instant, with Naruto kicking the one to the left in the stomach and elbowing the other, who had his nose broke in the process. The 2 of them were thrown away by the force of the impacts and now lied unconscious on the ground. Yet, Naruto did not relax. There was one rapist left. "Why you don't come any closer or I'll kill her." The blonde turned his head towards the frightened man, who was seemingly about to piss his pants in fear. He was now standing against a wall, with his arm around the woman's neck and the same knife still on her throat. Naruto watched with renewed anger as the naked woman continued to sob, her desperate eyes meeting his own sharp ones. Naruto felt his anger reach new levels as the disgusting rapist smirked devilishly and used his free hand to grab one of her breasts quite roughly, making her squirm in pain and embarrassment. The shinobi gritted his teeth in pure rage as he felt his eyes burning, like they were set on fire without being able to think clearly. Naruto let out a powerful scream before two beams of red light erupted from his orbs, heading at high speeds towards the criminal. The rapist had barely time to react as the beams hit one of his hands, forcing him to instantly drop the knife he was holding as he felt his skin burning painfully. As soon as he took a step back, holding his hand and crying in pain, Naruto was by his side. He grabbed him by the neck and raised the man a few inches above his head. The woman fell to her knees as her captor's features turned into a shocked expression, and Naruto watched in bitter pleasure as the rapist gasped for air and tried to pry the boy's hand off his neck. What are you? With his eyes and mouth wide open, the criminal soon found himself losing consciousness as his pained lungs tried to get some air. The last thing he heard before passing out was the voice of the teen speaking in a different language. Shinobi. Naruto had to refrain from ending his life right there, and then as he knew the woman was watching, instead, he released his hold from the man's neck and took a deep breath. As the last of his opponents fell to the floor, Naruto's mind finally registered what had happened. From his eyes he had fired some kind of energy which, even if it only burned the skin on his enemy's hand, was something clearly related to his supposed alien's heritage. It seemed that, apart from the abilities he'd developed so far, there were others that he'd yet to discover. The fact he apparently possessed such powers greatly thrilled him, and Naruto couldn't help but stare at his hands, no longer willing to believe he was a mere shinobi born in the elemental nations. After everything he had lived in such a short amount of time, it was clear Kakashi and Sarutobi were right to think of him as an outworlder. If that's true, then my arrival at this place must not have been mere coincidence, the blonde thought, balling his hands into fists with renewed determination. I feel like I'm going to find answers for what I'm really am here. Naruto suddenly let out a sigh, calming his rising enthusiasm. Before he could do that, he knew he'd have to deal with the criminals after he checked on the woman who was kneeling on the ground behind him, a look of clear shock written on her face. Yet, as he decided to approach her, her widened eyes suddenly turned to look at him, transmitting a sense of fear mixed with incredulity. Naruto gave the lady a calm smile and knelt in front of her, showing his palms to her. I'm not going to hurt you, miss, said he, and even if the woman didn't seem to fully understand him, she seemed to relax somewhat, allowing him to untie the ropes and gently remove the duct tape from her mouth. Despite a low moan of pain she emitted when the tape was removed, she felt relief flooding through her as she finally realized she'd been saved by a mere teen who prevented those monsters from raping her. There. Are you okay? Naruto had just finished putting his sleeveless black jacket over her naked figure when the woman threw herself at him, hugging her body to his in desperation, as if fearing he'd leave her alone. Thank you so much for rescuing me. She repeated those words again and again, sobbing uncontrollably. She didn't seem to notice that she was in her birth suit and hugging a male teen, who instead was very aware of the feeling of her body pressing against his mesh shirt. The young man blushed at this, but soon found himself smiling. Thanks to his actions, this lady was saved not only from being raped, but also from the post-rape trauma and memories that would have haunted her forever. Naruto eventually pulled himself away from the woman, his face and hers glowing brightly red as the boy zipped his jacket, which covered her body barely below her crotch. Then, he stood up and was about to turn around when the young woman in his early 30s grabbed his forearm, a pleading look on her reddened face, with cheeks traced by dried tears. Don't worry, as soon as I finish with them I'll take you somewhere safe. Even if they both spoke in different languages and she didn't understand what her rescuer was about to do, she did know she could trust him. After all, he'd managed to defeat her captors with little to no effort, something that was not shocking at all to her, as the world was filled with superheroes. Each with his or her own unique abilities and powers. Meanwhile, the blonde had pulled out a kunai from the holster at his waist, intending to finish the criminals as quickly as possible. If possibly hiding his actions from the woman, he didn't want her to watch as he did so, as it'd scare and most likely scar her mind, being that the reason why he held back while hanging the disgusting rapist by the throat. He'd drag the criminals into the darkest area of the alley and silently end their miserable lives. But as he decided to kill the leader first, his trained ears picked up the sound of someone landing silently on the ground just behind him. That's enough. Watch out. Naruto didn't need to be told twice as he sidestepped just in time to avoid an incoming punch originally aimed at his neck. He then ducked low enough to evade another attack, this time in form of a kick that headed straight for his head, and instead of getting away, the shinobi round-kicked his new foe, managing to throw him off balance. Though, as the young man stood and tried to sidekick his foe's chest, his opponent jumped backwards and threw a sharp double-edged knife at him that slightly reminded the shinobi of a bat. Naruto just caught the weapon by the middle between two fingers, holding it close to his face. His opponent, however, didn't seem impressed at all. "Are you here to help your friends finish what they started?" asked the blonde, his eyes starting to glow red as he focused onto the weapon he was holding. Both him and his opponent watched as the metal started to melt around the area Naruto was focusing his eyes on. Yet, and before the heat could spread to his fingers, the blonde let the blade fall to the ground, moving his once again blue eyes to the person in front of him. His new foe didn't take his sight off of him, though Naruto did notice the shock in his weird wide eyes, something that, along with the strange suit the skilled warrior in front of him was wearing, made him curious. His outfit consisted of a kind of strange dark gray bodysuit with the figure of a huge black bat on the chest. The man also wore dark blue boots and gloves, along with an utility belt around his waist, filled with strange-looking tools, about which Naruto could only try to guess their functionality and usage. Apart from the black long cape that hung from his shoulders and reached just above his ankles, his new opponent wore a kind of helmet with pointy ears and a mask that covered every aspect of his face, except from his lower and part of his upper jaw and lips. Naruto gazed into a pair of bright wide eyes that seemed to be staring at his very soul, and inwardly wondered who could be hiding under that suit that looked tight, yet flexible and reinforced. It seemed more of a combat suit now that he got a look at it, though he didn't see the need for it. Unless, of course, he was not a trained ninja like him, which seemed to be the case. As he decided to use his enhanced vision to see through the mask, he got the sight of a man in his early 30s with short, almost crippled dark hair and strong facial features. A pair of blue eyes stared back at him, as if the man knew he could see him. "I'm here to save her," the masked warrior eventually said, having recovered from his previous shock. While the man in the combat suit gestured towards the silent woman, who was still kneeling on the ground, Naruto's eyes widened as he found himself understanding what his opponent previously said. In spite of his initial surprise, he suddenly smiled at the prospect of finally having some of his questions answered by a person who could speak his language. "Who are you?" Naruto decided to ignore the man and instead retorted with a question of his own. "Where am I? What is this place?" "You're in Gotham. Gotham City," he answered, feeling his own patience grow thin. He didn't have time for games. "Who are you?" Once again, the blonde teen opted to avoid giving him his name. "And where's that? I've never heard of something like Gotham City before. Is this place far away from Konoha? That's where I need to go." "Wrong answer." And without warning, the masked warrior dashed forward and tried to elbow Naruto in the stomach, only for him to realize the boy didn't seem to be affected at all by the attack. He then raised his right fist and punched the blonde in the face hard. Though against all his expectations, Naruto stood still, blinking as he looked down upon his own abdomen. His foe's attacks hadn't hurt, in fact, he'd barely felt them at all. It was like his body was by some kind of reinforced armor which protected him from any kind of damage. "Cool," the blonde thought, smirking as he watched the warrior taking a few steps back and pulling something from his belt. "This just keeps getting better and better." Before his foe could even prepare his next attack, Naruto seemed to teleport in front of Batman as he was suddenly slamming a fist into the suited warrior's face. Said man was sent flying backwards by the force of the impact, but he, in comparison with the unconscious rapists, was stronger and more resilient and soon recovered while still in midair and made a backflip, managing to land on the ground before he crashed into something. The masked man narrowed his wide eyes at the teen while his mind beepized what he just went through. It seems he possessed super speed, strength, perfect reflexes, flexibility and on top of that heat vision and probably most, if not all of Clark's powers. Also, none of my attacks worked against him, which makes it clear who he is. I wonder. Naruto noticed that his opponent had taken a moment to think about something, and it was then he decided to raise his hands up in a tranquilizer manner. "Look, I just want to know where Konoha is. I've just arrived to a strange place I've never been, less seen before, and you're the first person that speaks my language." His opponent's eyes narrowed even further at that for a moment until he let out a silent sigh. From what he'd heard so far, the man felt that the boy was telling the truth and he had no intention to hurt the woman kneeling in silence a few inches away from them. But appearances can be deceiving, and the masked man knew better than to instantly trust this powerful teenager. Even if he didn't mean any harm, he clearly saw him walking up to his defeated opponents with the intention of finishing them. There was also the fact that the boy was very well trained in martial arts and knew how to defend himself in battle, something that made him even more dangerous than he was. He had to give him credit since the blonde had managed to not only defend himself against his attacks, but also landed a few hits on him. "If you want information, first tell me who you are." Naruto raised an eyebrow before crossing his arms over his chest. "I guess I can do that. My name is Naruto." "Who taught you how to battle?" "I practically learned by myself. Since I'm a shinobi of Konohagakure no Sado, I have full access to the library where many books detail taijutsu stances." "Shinobi," the man repeated with some disbelief. His Japanese was not perfect, but he knew that shinobi or ninja were supposed to be a kind of secret warrior clan which were highly trained for murder and to complete the most dangerous tasks. That did explain his abilities in combat, yet he'd no knowledge of a place called Konohagakure no Sado, or the village hidden in the leaves translated to English. Naruto nodded boringly at that before he said, "Now it's your turn to introduce yourself." "I'm Batman," he answered in a deep creepy voice that slightly unnerved the blonde. Though, it only lasted for a moment as the masked man, now identified as Batman, formulated his following question. "How did you come here?" "Well, it's actually a long story," Naruto shrugged before gesturing towards the immobile woman who perked up at seeing her savior point towards her. She had kept silent throughout the entire ordeal as she didn't understand they were talking about, watching with widened eyes as Batman and the handsome young man fought against each other. "Shouldn't we take her to safety or something?" "The police will take care of her," Batman then pointed at the unconscious men that were still in the same place Naruto had left them, "and the criminals you were trying to kill before I stopped you. Even if you protected her, you can't take the lives of her aggressors. Only murderers do that, and while you stay here, you will abide by the rules or I'll make you." The masked vigilante's strict and menacing tone had Naruto scoff instead of recoiling in fear and nod his head obediently, as Batman almost expected him to do. He wasn't afraid of someone who claimed to be a better person because he was too weak to apply real justice. Those people who rape, kill or even hurt innocents should be punished accordingly. Most people don't really change, especially criminals, with the majority of them tending to go back to their evil ways after a short period of being good. Batman didn't seem to share his ideals, but he too admit the boy had a point. Even so, by killing someone you end up becoming someone like them or worse. It's a hero's duty to bring true justice and abide by the rules, which means we do not take the lives of defeated criminals. The blonde just rolled his eyes and frowned, looking as though he wasn't willing to continue with the discussion. Naruto was a shinobi, and as such, sometimes he had to take the lives of his opponents, even if he actually disliked it. He knew some people could be redeemed, like when he had faced Nagato, and convinced him that he was going to put an end to all wars and bring peace to the nations. People like him that could be redeemed did bad things, but for the greater good, seeing no other way to have their goals and dreams accomplished. Naruto shook his head to get rid of his thoughts just in time as Batman started to speak, this time to someone the blonde couldn't see. Yet, as he focused his enhanced hearing, he noticed that a voice was coming out the masked man's ear, probably from some sort of earphone or something. He knew about those as Konoha shinobi tended to use them during missions as it facilitated team's communication. "Understood. I'll meet you there," he heard Batman's answering in the language everyone else seemed to speak there, but what barely managed to surprise Naruto was the fact that the masked man had never stopped looking at him during the entire ordeal. He didn't seem to trust him, especially with all the things they had spoken about until then. Naruto was about to ask another question when suddenly a distant sound caught his attention and he snapped his head towards the direction it came from. What the boy found was a really annoying sound soon grew louder, making him scowl. Something was approaching, and fast. "What's that?" he wondered aloud, only for Batman to ignore him. "You know I can't leave you alone by yourself," Batman said slowly, as if still weighing the options he had. "You could go rampage." The masked hero momentarily thought about sending the self-called shinobi to STARS labs in Gotham, where they could run some tests over him and determine the full extent of his powers. Maybe even find out more about his situation. But there was no way for him to make sure he'd not attack them or destroy the lab, even though he felt no ill will from him. The boy truly seemed lost, like someone from a different place, that he spoke Japanese and claimed to be a ninja, only added more questions to be answered. Besides, he doubted the branch of the labs at Gotham which specialized in weapons would have someplace strong enough to hold him down. The only other place he could think of was Arkham Asylum, but he wasn't a criminal, nor seemed to have psychotic disorders. Of course Batman could call his fellow League member and friend, Superman, and have him take care of the boy, who he suspected to be a Kryptonian, if the powers he had seen Naruto using so far were of any indication. Yet the question whether he was dangerous or not still remained, and Batman liked to be prepared for any possible contingency that may present itself in the future. On the other hand, he knew Clark would be delighted to meet a fellow Kryptonian. "Please," Naruto practically pleaded, knowing this weird guy that called himself a hero could very well be the only person right now that could provide him with the information he needed. Or part of it, at least. He now knew where he was, the question was how did he get there, and how could he go back to Konoha? "I just need some answers. I promise I won't cause any problems." By then, the annoying sounds, which were in fact sirens, had grown loud enough for Batman to know that the police was getting near. He had to make a choice. And he chose to assist the shinobi for now. "Follow me." Naruto smiled in gratitude and watched as Batman pulled a weapon from his belt that reminded him of the ones the rapists tried to use against him. Then, and after aiming it at the roof of a nearby building, a rope attached to a hook flew at it, pulling the hero up as soon as it hooked to the roof's edge. The blonde kept on looking as the masked man disappeared in the shadows and was about to follow him until a feminine voice forced his head towards the source. "Wait." The woman blushed as she shakily stood up, walking up to him with a smile. "Thank you." With a long kiss to his cheek, Naruto's face reddened like a tomato, and he awkwardly rubbed the back of his head. He quickly recovered from his state as he realized Batman was probably waiting for him and waved at the woman before jumping high into the sky and disappearing from her sight. As the police arrived and immediately went to check on her, the woman kept on hugging Naruto's jacket, only now noticing that he'd left it behind. "Kakashi-sensei. And Aichin is gone." The Jounin leader of Team 7 froze for a moment before his visible eye looked at Natsuki in disbelief. Even Sakura, who was there as well that morning, looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "Calm down, Natsuki," Kakashi instructed, as said girl was nearly hyperventilating by then, probably having looked for her beloved brother everywhere. "Now then, how do you know that? The Naichin didn't not come home last night." Natsuki all but shouted, her nerves growing stronger with every minute they spent there doing nothing. "I thought he'd show up as he wasn't at Ichiraku or at the Hokage's monument when I left Tsunade-sama's tent. But he has gone missing since then and. While Kakashi's visible eye seemed to narrow at that, Sakura moved her head from her sensei to her teammate. "Wait, did you guys have a secret meeting that I wasn't told of? Have you checked everywhere?" The Jounin asked, opting to ignore a fuming Haruno. "He couldn't have left the village. Kitetsu and Izuma would have immediately notified me or Danzo if he tried to leave." Now that Danzo had been appointed as the main choice for Rokudaime Hokage, since Tsunade wasn't in any condition to exercise her role as leader, Kakashi and everyone in Konoha were forced to report to him. Though he felt like informing the old man about Naruto's supposed disappearance would only bring more trouble. "Yes, everywhere. I even used my Kage Bunshin to ask around the village. But nobody has seen Naruto since yesterday. And even then, people told me they saw him inside Konoha. Hey. Don't ignore me. Can someone explain me what's going on?" Later, Sakura, Kakashi shook his head. "If my suspicions are true, Naruto must still be inside the village. If not, he has managed to evade the guards at the entrance and head out." The Jounin was beginning to feel a headache coming by just thinking about the implications this would bring along. They needed to find Naruto, and fast. Danzo was supposed to leave later that day for a 5 Kage summit that was to be held in the Land of Iron. Apparently, the 4th Raikage wanted all villages to unite against Akatsuki, who had 7-tailed beasts at that moment and were planning to capture the remaining 2. The Hachibi and the Kyubi, the latter being in Natsuki's possession. He wondered for a moment if the 5 Kages would reach an agreement to fight the organization and, at the same time, protect both Jinchuricas by hiding them somewhere safe. But with Danzo in charge of Konoha, he doubted that would be the case. "This is all your fault." Natsuki suddenly snapped, breaking Kakashi out of his reverie. He looked at her and saw that non-surprisingly, she was blaming him for Naruto's disappearance. If you had told him the truth from the very beginning, all of this could have been avoided. And without giving him a chance to reply, the girl growled at a shocked Hot-Aki and shunshined away, intending to keep on searching for her brother. Maybe the Kyubi would know where to find him. Kakashi meanwhile just stood there, blinking as he wondered why everyone got angry at him as of lately. Sure, he knew Natsuki had a point to get pissed, but he'd decided to wait to tell his student about his origin when he was old enough to handle the truth without having a mental breakdown or something. That he'd gone missing right after finding out that he was from outer space just proved his point. Kakashi-sensei. The silver-haired Jounin sighed tiredly at the tone Sakura used to call him. The pink-haired girl sounded angry as well, yet the Jounin could understand why. Even if this had nothing to do with her, she was part of Team 7 and she deserved to know. But not now when Naruto needed them. "I'll explain everything later, Sakura," and before the girl could even open her mouth to retort, Kakashi was already making hand seals. Kuchus no Jutsu. The Hokage's office had seen better days, though since Danzo had taken the seat of Hokage for himself, the decoration had changed significantly. No longer did the numerous stacks of papers fill almost every inch of the wooden desk, and the old warhawk had taken care of the bottles of sake Tsunade Haim used to hide in the drawers. The most notorious change in the room was the omniscient darkness that loomed about, as Danzo had the windows covered with dark curtains with the kanji of written on them. He liked privacy and secrecy, believing in those terms as some of the main principles for a successful rule. Having his shinobi follow his every command without knowing the reasons behind an order would ultimately lead to peace, as he believed morals and ethics should be placed below the village's interests. At the moment, Danzo Shimura was sitting behind the wooden desk, the Hokage's hat sitting proudly atop his head, as part of it hid his facial features. Without it, the tiny smile on his wrinkled lips would have been visible for all to see. Danzo-sama. The old man barely seemed to acknowledge one of his Anbu's arrival at all, shifting in his seat ever so slightly. FK, Danzo finally spoke, keeping most of his visage hidden below the pointed hat. Have you succeeded? The young Anbu with short orange hair tied into a short ponytail didn't answer right away, showing some reluctance at first. He quickly overcame his doubts and decided to face the incoming consequences, if any. I have managed to spy on Kakashi Hotaki and the QB's Jinchuriki, as you ordered. And? Not even Kakashi-san seemed to know about the Jinchuriki's brother's whereabouts. He seemed as surprised as the girl was when learning about the news. Contrary to what FK was expecting as a reaction from his master, like him being disappointed at his lack of success and therefore deeming him worthy of punishment, Danzo let out a snort. He then proceeded to raise his head in order for him to look at the best Anbu under his command, before saying, "Good. Danzo-sama. The boy may have gone missing, yet his departure could not have occurred at a better time. Without him around, we can fool the QB's Jinchuriki and manipulate her so that she can be used as a weapon against Konoha's enemies." The candidate for Rokudaime Hokage gave his Anbu no chance to reply as he stood up from his chair, grabbing a wooden cane lying next to his seat with his free hand. "Wherever he is, he'll not be able to interfere with my plans for the time being. I take it Torin has informed you?" Danzo merely nodded. "I've been aware of the boy's true identity for a long time. However, I never expected that thing to teleport him somewhere else. Do you think he is still here, in the elemental nations?" As the old warhawk supported the weight of his body on the cane, he shook his head thoughtfully. "I highly doubt it. The artifact was too advanced for us to understand how it worked at the time, but I believe something in the boy's DNA must activated some sort of mechanism that took him to wherever he came from. Nevertheless, this is only mere speculation." FK inclined his head as Danzo walked past him before stopping right in front of the exit door. His head tilted slightly in FK's direction. "It's a pity we won't be able to use the boy as well, as he was one of the best shinobi that Konoha ever produced. But matters not, my plans will succeed." The old man smirked at the prospect of securing Konoha's position as the most powerful village above the others. For that to happen, though, he knew he'd have to deal with Akatsuki and then with the rest of the Kages. They would vow to follow his command or be replaced by others who could be easily manipulated. Let's get torn. I have a Kage summit to attend to. So this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video guys. Let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.